and welcome to Patreon 76, which is gonna be all about what happens if the Royal Navy retains the fleet units of the Royal Naval Air Service in 1918. And it's an interesting video, because an interesting topic, because honestly, I thought I'd done this one before. Honestly, I thought I had. I almost didn't allow it into the actual selection, because I thought I'd done this one before. And I went through all the titles of my videos and I found I have skipped around it. There have been various ones which have touched on this topic, but not a single one which has been focused on this topic. So, I sort of have done this before, but I haven't done this one before, if that makes sense. So, Royal Navy retains fleet units of the Royal Naval Air Service in 1918. How would I have changed the RN Carrier Operation Model 2? Now, when the closest one I've done on this, and there should be a link to it down below, was of course about the Admiral class vessels and if they'd been converted into aircraft carriers. And the reasoning for that was, well, if there's been a successful strike with Sopwith Cuckoos, etc., the Royal Navy's going to want some big strike carriers. And frankly, courageous and glorious are cute, but they ain't no Admiral class. They are just nowhere near that. And as said, I've always had suspicions because of the way Camel Airs is treated and the way they're talked about in terms of strike carriers, experience and understanding of strike carriers when they are building Ark Royal. I have a strong suspicion that they were converting one of their the Admiral class they were building, or at least were asked to work on that as a prospect into a carrier. So that has been a topic of a previous video. Also, I think proposed by Carl Hanshaw, but I have to check to go be 100% sure on that one. So, this one is going to be different. This one is going to be very, very different. Because this one is not looking at that. And for that I had to change things to make the carriers fit. This time I just have to change it to make the Royal Navy retain the fleet units of the Royal Naval Air Service. Carl's actual specific question was retaining the Fleet Air Arm. And, of course, the Fleet Air Arm doesn't exist, because in 1918, basically, the Fleet Air Arm is formed, and it becomes the sort of RAF, Pseudo Royal Navy, RAF, Air Ministry, Admiralty fudge that the British have for the next 20-odd years to provide naval aviation, in terms of the aircraft component of naval aviation for the fleet, and that isn't really what exists in 1918. What exists in 1918 are fleet units of the Royal Naval Air Service, and various other units which could be sort of pseudo fleet units, i.e. they're fleet enough that they could be included in forming a fleet, and a lot of vessels and a lot of interesting assets, and it's kind of a case of going to be working out how that would all change into things. So, let's see. Hello, Knight6831. Hello, John Shea. Hello, Jack Ray. Hello, Peter Dawson. Calvin Gasberg. Sirburn. Hello. Haven't seen you for a while, I think. How are you doing? And John South. And History Vanguard. And hello... Ooh, Stephen Richards. Hello, how are you doing? Hello, Melee1640. Hello, Bijon. Hello, David Goulding. And hello, DG40. Also, Byron Newman, hello, Carl Gasberg, and hello, Wayne's World of Science and Technology, and everyone else. Steve Clarke, hello. Seneca Nero, hello. And Melanie6040, hello. Friendly Sea Mine, hello, haven't seen you in a while. First off, though, before I start, as I said, XSplit has literally updated. I've been running and recording on it all day. It hasn't updated. Literally, at exactly 7 o'clock, I swear they link it in, and at 7 o'clock at night is when it's sort of a 6:50. It was 18:59. It suddenly said I need to update, and I've got new stuff. So it's updated all sorts of new things onto it. So I'm hoping the sound is okay, because I'm hoping it hasn't lost any of my settings. Because there's a habit, when it updates, it loses settings and goes all sorts of weird. So if it is weird, tell me now, and I will try and fix it. Paul Westwick, would this include land-based aircraft? No. The moment it includes, it said Fleet Air Arm. It's land-based aircraft were, of course, hived off into Coastal Command. and various other things. So it's going to be interesting. But there are some aircraft which, whilst they are technically land-based, are also part of the fleet, so I can use them. And there's a couple of squadrons which are sort of nascent. Yeah, this is going to be fantastic. Knock-on implications beyond 1925 would be wild. It gets really, really wild really quickly because you start having to work through things. Because you have to be internally consistent. Now, what I will say also is I'm going to break my 2 Iron Brew can limit tonight. I'm going to still have 2 cans of 1901, but I'm going to have some cans of regular Iron Brew as well. This is because I'm currently functioning on, well, occasionally the old insomnia gets really into high gear, and that combined with various other fun things going on at the moment to do with, broader speaking, family health and canine sleep tapans, apparently, means that I am currently... So, I'm going to be running on... To make sure I get through this all, I'm going to be running on sugar and caffeine, aka Iron Brew. So, just explain that, because occasionally people, when I am stopping and thinking things, think that I'm running on something else, i.e. alcohol. But as I've said before, and this is something which perhaps I do need to say as the channel grows, and as more people watch my videos, I don't drink alcohol. I have nothing against people who do, it's perfectly fine. I have a version of enhanced cowardice, in that whilst my grandfather could hold his alcohol quite well, and whilst my father, when sober, was a lovely gentleman who could be was extremely erudite and very good at his job, when he did imbibe too much, he was not able to control his temper. I, wishing to never... And this is something, when I was younger, I must admit I was angry about it, and I had to work through that, but now it's more a case of, I wish to never disappoint myself, as I'm sure it must have disappointed himself, looking back at his actions. So I don't drink. I will never therefore be drunk while recording a video or being live. At any point. Unless someone decides to spike my drink, which I would really hope they wouldn't, and is another reason I drink Iron Brew, because this stuff, in my experience, changes colour at the slightest hint of anything being added into it. And that's usually a helpful... Now, I'm sure there are some things which will not change its colour. I'm not going to say it's inviolable, but yeah, just a heads up for if you're drinking in a place which is a bit... This stuff really does act as its own litmus test. It does like to change colour at the slightest impurity added into it. The budget, I'm not changing much in this timeline, but also you have to remember the RN, if they have more control, can fight more cohesively for the budget. One of the problems for naval aviation that it suffered was that it was disjointed in part from the naval budget. In that it was the Navy spending the money, and the Navy was always providing the money for the Fleet Air Arm, but it was billed through the Admiralty. So it's going to sound strange, but one of the problems they found, and this is something which actually comes up and I'm going to discuss more about the formation of the Fleet Air Arm, is the Air Ministry starts off by adopting Royal Flying Corps accountancy systems, which have been terrible in World War I, and were one of the reasons why the RFC was so anti the RNAS, because the RNAS always looked like they were getting better equipment than the RFC, and actually it's because the Army accountancy system was just up the pole and couldn't handle dealing with the necessities of the RFC. There's even a whole different thing about how you account for engines. It's often brought up as some sort of conspiracy theory that, you know, the RFC, when they're accounting for engine production, saying the reason to form the Royal Air Force is because there is going to be a huge surplus of engines next year. And the Royal Navy's going, there's not going to be. And the reason the Royal Navy didn't think it was going to be was because, of course, you use engines as replacement engines in existing aircraft when the engines go wrong. And some of the engine manufacturer you're producing, which you're accounting is producing whole engines, is actually producing spare parts for existing engines. But RFC accounting didn't include that. So when the RFC go, there's going to be a surplus of engines, They honestly believe they are saying the true thing, because that is the facts according to their accounting system. And when the Royal Naval Air Service and the Royal Navy is going, no, there won't be, they are correct, but they're also not able to. They're also speaking the truth, and then it doesn't mean the RFC are lying. And this is one of the foundational things which causes a whole myth around the RAF creation. On one side, it's looked as a complete hoodwink, and the other side, it's looked as they did an accountancy snafu. When honestly, it's the case of both sides being correct, just one side actually having an accountancy system which takes into account the reality of maintenance and repair. So you can imagine, if I give that as an example, the joys that come about when you've got the Admiralty and the Air Ministry trying to organise procurement. You also have the fact that for the Admiralty, it's going to sound strange, but you have these things called motor torpedo boats, which use the same engines as most of the aircraft do. And you have a lot of motor launches fitted on various vessels. Now, in the nicest way, this means the Admiralty can often order a huge number of engines in one go. And those would be the same engines. So the Admiralty, if they're talking to an engine manufacturer, can actually on occasion be ordering far more engines than the Air Ministry can. And because the Admiralty likes to standardise on these things, the Admiralty can achieve what you would call efficiencies of scale. Now, this was going to affect engine manufacturers chosen, because believe it or not, there are manufacturers in Britain who are more able to scale up their engine production, and there are manufacturers which aren't. So while Rolls-Royce is an engine manufacturer which produces very high quality engines, they are less able to scale up their manufacture numbers to the level of which that the Royal Navy would be looking for, as, say, Napier or Bristol. It's fun, and we're going to be getting into this. I mean, would it be run similar to how Japan was like in our time? Not particularly, no, because the RAF is still formed, and the RAF still has the heavy bomber force and the fighters, and land-based aircraft and the coastal command go to the RAF. You would see some more political bashing between the Navy and the RAF, but there's also going to be less competition in a way, because the Navy's going to just be procuring its own stuff. And whilst the RAF will be trying to make the case of bombers, not battleships, they will probably try and ignore the Royal Navy's fighter and aviation component, because if they try to take it over or try to organise it, they're going to have to put up, and it's going to quickly become quite a big problem for them. But you have to remember also, originally, the Royal Navy, the Fleet Air Arm component of the Royal Navy, was a major part of the air strength of the United Kingdom. And this is another thing which caused problems from the very beginning, because the RAF refused to stop accounting for those aircraft as being part of the overall strength of the Air Force, and therefore part of the air defence strength of the United Kingdom. That caused fun, because of course the Royal Navy was they're not part of the air defence strength of the United Kingdom, they're going to be coming over some fleet. Well, if we need them for the air defence of the UK, the fleet won't have them. Well, then what's the point of them being part of the fleet, and why are we paying for them? Well, you're paying for them, but that's to do with what the Air Ministry needs them to do. No, that they're paying them because the Admiralty is going to take away. And actually, at one point, there was a huge fight in about 1928, 1929, when the Air Ministry said for a full air exercise, the Royal Navy had to bring their carriers home to provide them with the aircraft that they had for overseas, because they were part of the air defence of the United Kingdom. And the Admiralty went, no. And this is what led to... it laid the ground for the later 1937 INSCIP report, because basically the hurrah and the absolute argument over that caused issues which led to basically the government having to step in and go, no, you can't do that. And we didn't realise you were including the Fleet Air Arm aircraft in your accounts of aircraft. At which point the RAF then turned around to, we now need more aircraft. And they started procuring bombers instead of fighters, despite the fact the aircraft the Royal Navy would have provided them with were fighters, because the Royal Navy didn't have any bombers. And it's a really weird time, okay? It's a really weird thing. You have to remember, though, you have to almost divide off the Air Ministry from the Air Force, because what I would say is the Air Ministry, the political side of the Air Force, are almost from day one acting like they are under constant siege. And they are to an extent, but they get very nasty over it, and this causes more problems than help. I'm Michael Cooch. Bonjour, well on general staff got logistics process wrong. I'm shocked. I know, it's amazing. The accountancy process for the Royal Flying Corps is an absolute mess. Wings Water Science Technology. Amazing number of British aircraft used French engine in World War I. Was that an area the French were ahead? No. It was more a case of it was easier logistically. Because, again, especially with the, let's put it this way, the large number of aircraft things using French engines was usually because they were either using French-built aircraft or they were using French engines because they could procure their spare parts of them more easily in France. Because, again, you have to set up a logistics process. And the Royal Navy set up and functioned a logistics process like they would to function and support small boats and things all around the world. They're used to supporting it. You know, you build up depots, spare parts, and all sorts of things. It took the Royal Flying Corps a disturbingly long time to build an equivalent process, and even by the end of World War One, let's put it this way. Even till the end of World War One, when the Royal Flying Corps and Royal Naval Air Service had to be combined into the Royal Air Force, the units still depended on their Royal Navy Air Service or Royal Flying Corps backup and support systems, and the RFC system former units were trying to transfer themselves over to RNAS systems because the RNAS systems were that much better at supplying them. And it's not. Honestly, you can blame the War Ministry in a way. You can blame a lot of organisations. But the fact is, for the War Ministry, their system they designed worked perfectly well for supplying troops in the field, for supplying the logistics they needed for all their systems. And it even worked for supplying tanks. It's just aircraft were being used far more often, and the Royal Navy adapted the system they used for boat supplies. That's what the Royal Navy did. They adapted the system they used for supplying their boats, motor torpedo boats and ship's boats and all the things, and supplying those with the spare parts. That's the system they built theirs on, and that's the thing. The Royal Navy had a better system to build it on from the beginning because they'd had to on their systems, and because they adapted that one in, then you have the system, you have the whole problem come up, and basically the RFC just don't adapt and don't employ it because it's the naval system. And even when you have RFC officers going, you know, there's 2/3 of them seem to believe it's the Royal Navy's doing underhand deals with companies when they get things cheaper and they get things easier. And it is the power of the Admiralty negotiating departments. Yes, they're not doing underhand deals, they're just ordering in far bigger quantities. And that's the first thing. And secondly, there's the fact the Admiralty system, because it takes into account spare parts and all these things, is providing, as part of the orders, ongoing commitment. So the RFC sort of thought, well, you've built the 100 engines you'd need to build for the Royal Navy, you're therefore finished. And they went, no, we're still building parts for the Navy. Why are you still doing parts for the Navy? Spare parts. Why? They've got the 100 engines. Why do they need spare parts? Well, because, you need to keep those aircraft flying. Hello, Tanif. %, 968 from Rolls-Royce are a bit of a scale issue. Ashibara? My impressive rating things recalls that yes, the RAF controlled the pilots, but not the observers and not the tail air gunners, or telegraphist air gunners, as they became. Yeah, it's something you have to learn. So here is the start of the RNAS, and I wanted to start sort of getting into some of the details about them. It's worthwhile thinking what kind of scale of organisation we're dealing with. And the Royal Naval Air Service, at the end of the Royal Naval Service was one of the strongest air forces in the world. And what do I mean when I say that? Well, I've got my actual figure somewhere. On formation, let's see. Oh, I've got it. On formation. I got my notes there. On formation, it had been 55 seaplanes and shipborne aircraft, 40 aeroplanes, 7 airships, etc. And this is all back in 1913. By 1918, it is in hundreds of aircraft. In fact, already by August 1914, it had gone up to about 100 aircraft and 700 personnel. By and I have a link to this article which I found very useful for the stats, and I have gone back to again, and I'm going to make sure I sort of show it to you. Which page is that on? It's part 1. Oh, this is annoying when you lose your notes. This is the trouble with it resetting. It lost my notes for me. By strength. Oh, it's page 3, isn't it? Yeah. By, yeah. Where's the note? Oh, there it is, yes. It was nearly 1,000 aircraft they had at their disposal by the time. They had, during their World War I, they dropped roughly 1,200 bombs with a total weight of 30 tons, which doesn't sound like much in our terms, but in World War I terms, it's a lot of bombs. And that was just in the Mediterranean alone. And, you know, they are an absolutely massive organisation by the time of their demise. They are probably the 3rd largest air force in the world at the time. There's the French Air Force, there's the Royal Air Force, the Royal Flying Corps, and then there's the Royal Naval Air Service in World War One, and those are the big 3 by the end of World War One. And so when you combine the two together, you do kind of overtake the French. And this can be seen in the huge number of bases. These are just the base it has in England alone, going to 2 columns. Then you've got Scotland, Wales, France, in the Eastern Mediterranean, and elsewhere in the world. And Durban, South Africa, Otranto, Italy, Malta, Mombasa, Kenya. In France, the squadrons were numbered 1 to 17. In the Eastern Mediterranean, they were lettered A to G and included Z. There are a few other squadrons as well. In fact, the Royal Naval Air Service has a lot of number 1 squadrons. Depending on where they are in the world, they're the first squadron raised in that area. They're called the number 1 squadron. It's one of the areas of this organisation in the Royal Naval Air Service. But, you know, there's also probably a little bit of a history of the fact that it's expanded quite so dramatically, because they start off in World War One with the outbreak with just 3 wings, and they are combined between they are organised from those 3 wings, and you know, wing those quickly sort of those wings expanded, and in Central Europe they got to wings number 6. Wing 3 is formed, deformed, and all sorts of things because it kept being used for bombing missions, strategic bombing as well. But it's disbanded finally in 1917. Wings 4 and 5 were basically expansions of Wing 1, with Wing 4 getting fighters and Wing 5 getting bombing duties. So, broadly speaking, it's kind of interesting, but there are lighter wings which are used for things like the Sopwith Cuckoo, etc. And so those are sort of land-based aircraft we'll be talking about moving along. Remember, this is not the Royal Air Force. This is the Royal Flying Corps, which is the issue. And also, there's a huge issue because if you consider the various reforms, the Fisher-Semple reforms, etc., which can brought engineers into the fold of the Royal Navy Officer Corps, and you then have the Army needs to go through that again itself. And if we consider, I think the RAF is just about to be headed for the first time in its history by an engineering officer. I think the new chief of the air staff is an engineering officer. I don't think there's been one before, but I could be wrong. Chiefs of the air staff are not my forte. But I know the one coming in is an engineer, and it's quite a big hullabaloo about it. So, the thing is, I would say that the trouble with the RAF in terms of a lot of things that happen to them is the Air Ministry gets dominated by a very specific group from the Royal Flying Corps who basically view everything in terms of refighting the trenches of World War One and are obsessed with bombing. And they slowly get to them and their sort of their supporters / friends / people who agree with them get to sort of position. But that's not really a scenario we have to worry about so much in this scenario, because in this scenario we're talking about what happened at the state in the Royal Naval Air Service. And in 1918, on the 31st of March 1918, we are dealing with one of the world's largest air services. Approximately the third largest in the world. So you cannot overstate how massive and capable it is. Also, you have to remember that, again, when we're talking about the RNAS and the Royal Flying Corps, the difference is, from the get-go, engineering officers are involved, and the Royal Navy is used to engineering officers being part of them, and part of their structures. The Royal Flying Corps, Lord love them, get probably... Well, let's put it this way. They get a lot of cavalry officers. And I don't like to sound bad about the British Army, because the British Army are very brave in World War One. But let's be honest, cavalry officers in Britain do not have the greatest reputation. Now they have the reputation of being very brave, and some of the bravest and finest cavalry ever on that one. But they also have a reputation for perhaps not thinking about the broader situation. They think about the fight they're in. New AKB 4472. How did RFC accounting not understand spare parts? Because of the people who set up RFC accounting. Wayne, that's not today's question, so I'm not getting into that one. So, the current 5th Sea Lord in 1918 is a gentleman called Rear Admiral Sir Godfrey Marshall Payne. Now, I have talked about him before. And he's a pretty good officer. I'm never quite sure what to how do I put this, where I would say he would end up, because he actually, historically, ends up joining the Royal Air Force. He's promoted to he's made a Major General, which is the equivalent of a Rear Admiral. So in the nicest way, when people say he's promoted to Major General, you can't be promoted to Major General from Rear Admiral. They are both the equivalent rank. And I realise RAF ranks at the time were a little bit weird, but yeah, he was a Rear Admiral. He then goes and joins the Royal Air Force. He's transferred in 1918, and he becomes their Master General of Personnel. He's promoted to Air Vice Marshal, and he's then made an Inspector General of the Royal Air Force. When he retires in 1920, that post is taken away from him, and he's granted on the rank of retirement as a Rear Admiral because he spent most of his service time in the Royal Navy. But he's basically been a Rear Admiral for the whole time because he was a Major General then. It's just the weirdness of the time. Hello, Mikey. So he was a sort of Rear Admiral anyway as 5th Sea Lord. He was responsible for all naval aviation. This is the point at which, again, you have this argument that comes off with the Royal Navy sometimes. People go, oh, they're not an air-minded service. When you consider you've made an actual Sea Lord whose sole job is to be responsible for naval aviation, and by the way, think about this, in 1937, when the British, when the INSCIP report is produced, the 5th Sea Lord post disappears in 1918, and in 1937, pretty much at the moment that they have INSCIP award comes through and they know they're going to be getting the Fleet Air Arm, and they control the Fleet Air Arm fully back, they make a guy called Alexander Ramsay the 5th Sea Lord again. So he's made that post in 1938. And he serves in that post most of World War II, for a large chunk of World War II. I think it's still about 1942, so 1938 to 1942 is roughly 4 years, but I'm not 100% sure of when it was in 1942, so he could have been out of there a while. And he's, of course, again, I would like to point out this, Alexander Ramsay, who takes his post on, is married to a member of the royal family. He marries Princess Patricia of Connaught. Who was, of course, a granddaughter of Queen Victoria. But this is not, of course, Godfrey's history. Godfrey goes off and joins the Royal Air Force. But you have to think, if the Royal Navy had kept control of its Fleet Air Arm, well, the 5th Sea Lord would have stayed in post. They would have kept the 5th Sea Lord. Because why did they judge they needed to have a 5th Sea Lord? Because they decided that aviation was new enough and a novel enough area of development that you needed someone at the top table who understood it and knew it and was there to articulate its case. To interface with the 3rd Sea Lord on the creation of new aircraft, to interface with the 2nd Sea Lord on the creation of new personnel systems and how you deal with it, to interface with the 4th Sea Lord on the logistics and the support of operations, to interface with the 1st Sea Lord on broader operations. You need this person at this rank and this position. And again, as said, the Royal Navy re-established that immediately. Immediately they get the Fleet Air Arm control back in 1938. After 1937, they established in 1938. So, therefore, I have no qualms in saying that this role would probably pursue, and Godfrey Marshall Payne would probably continue in it for a good couple of years post-World War I. Because, again, why do you change him? Yes, you can argue he needs to go and have fleet time. But he's now in the Admiral's post, so you might send him out to become Rear Admiral aircraft carriers. This could well be a role he goes to. He could go and become Rear Admiral aircraft carriers if you have aircraft carriers to, give him that sea time. or even Vice Admiral aircraft carriers if you decide you want to keep him. There are some interesting comments going on about the Boer War, etc. going on here. I'm going to answer some of the questions in the chat. Friendly soon, if you would have worldwide logistics supply, would this mean that the Dominion of Air Forces would be better off come war, as there would already be infrastructure in place? Probably, because there would be some fleet air arm infrastructure in place worldwide. There already was a little bit, but there would probably be more of it. Because the Royal Navy would probably have built it. Because they'd have had to. They built a little bit as it was anyway. The RFC didn't forget that things break. They just... It's a whole issue, okay? There are historians who are far better placed than me on it. And they would tell you that they do have systems, they just don't work as well as the Royal Naval Air Service systems. And I am simplifying it to a degree, I will admit that. Mainly from the point of view, if I simplify it, then I don't have to spend the entire next 2.5 hours explaining RFC versus Royal Naval Air Service accountancy systems, which, whilst I'm sure there are a good dozen or so of you who would love to have me explain that, I'm fairly certain that would probably be one of my lowest performing videos ever known to mankind, because I can't imagine there are many people who would click on the title of it, RFC versus RNAS Accounting Systems of World War I. Oh, good lord, there are probably some accountants who might like it, but the rest of you wouldn't. The vast majority of people would not. And, you know, I'm not even sure if I could stay awake long enough to talk about that. Apologies to the historians who are specialists in it. You are a very special and committed breed, and I am bow down in worship of all of you for being able to do it. You can do something which I just could not hack, okay? I will admit that. Magnus, doesn't it suggest if pilots were fleet, then these men would have been a source of future carrier captains, more practical flying experience? Well, the observers were, but the trouble is the observers start to become captains about 1944, when they sort of have got through the ranks and got up the level to start to become captains, etc. And there are some naval officers who do become captains. So please, the thing is, it's the break. Okay, it's a loss of officers in the next 5 years after this point. The Royal Navy Fleet Air Arm starts becoming naval-dominated again from about 1925, 1927 onwards. So, in terms of personnel and getting back naval officers who, of course, have the dual command system, and we will get into why that's not having that is a good thing later. But what you would have is you wouldn't have that break. You'd have the continued fleet officers coming through at the various ranks. So you would have naval officers who are aviation personnel going through, and they would be at Greenwich and be all those things. So you probably still would... I doubt the RN would ever have a system whereby only aviators could become captains of carriers or anything like that. That's just not the way the Royal Navy works, because the Royal Navy would consider that absurd. But they would probably have a more robust system for training officers and experienced officers, and so therefore you're less likely to end up with some of the issues you have in World War II. Because again, it's very easy to blame captains requesting to take their carriers home on their own. But you should also be able to apportion some blame to admirals for letting them do it, because letting something which is a capital asset go home on its own without any escort is kind of stupid. So, yes, you can blame the captain, but you can also blame the admiral, and I would blame both. Wasn't that large air service? The other large air service would be cut in post-war budgets, but we haven't got on to post-war budgets yet. We're talking about 1918. Post-war budgets are something still to come. I got into it with a guy online basically saying basically all navies were battleship brained. You look at the huge investment that every competent navy made in aircraft and air defenses. They were all keenly aware. They just didn't have a crystal ball. Yes, And it's the joy of history. It's very easy to write them off and go, oh, they're battleship brained, and it's very silly to say so, because it means you haven't bothered to study it or think about it at all. Because if you're truly a battleship brained force, why are you investing in anything else? We do not need that video. And I said, Alex, accountants tend to have lots of money. Wouldn't it be amazing if you did that video and it became one of your best videos and caused your channel to begin to take off? Oh, good lord, no. Don't make me do that video. It would be useful, it would be useful insomnia. It could be that, Sibero, it could be that. We're not getting to the invasion on Crete just yet. No, there was a pilot who became the ship's captain long before during World War II. There's actually, I've got him around. He goes. Casper John is a good example. He becomes a captain long before, during World War II. In fact, I think before World War II. Casper John is, and he commands carriers in World War II. He goes on to become First Sea Lord, and I have many stories about junior naval officers sent to get stuff off him and finding him painting with his wife and in the admiral's accommodations and just, having an afternoon's painting session and being, let's put it this way, alternatively clothed. So, we need a reason for why, okay? And as I said, the reason I used for why in the Admiral class was a Sopwith Cuckoo attack had been successful. So the British had done a successful torpedo attack on Wilhelmshaven. So I wasn't going to use that this time, because that would then basically be A, a repeat of that video, and B, it would necessitate not just the Fleet Air Arm being maintained, part of the Royal Navy, but it would also create the added extra of the Admiral class carriers being justified to being built, in which case it would be a complete repeat of that video, but it would also be, how do I put this politely, that's 2 changes from history. I haven't just had to change, that's not a change I've had to make that change to justify and take it from there. That's multiple changes I've taken down. So that's not really an option. But we do have to consider what the RNS was doing. So they had fleet roles: reconnaissance, patrolling coast for enemy ships and submarines, and attacking enemy coastal territory. For example, the RNS systematically, as possible, searched 4,000 square miles of the Channel, the North Sea, and the vicinity of the Straits of Gibraltar for U-boats daily. Daily, they are scouring 4,000 square miles. Daily. This meant in 1917 alone, they say that 175 U-boats managed to attack 107. We don't know how many they caused to dive and use up pressure endurance. We don't know. Just on, people sing the praise of logistics but won't sit through a video on accounting. There's an irony here. There is. Hello, Mashadosel. So, this is what we're looking at. And by the way, this is a picture shamelessly stolen from Wikipedia. Because my view is, if the pictures are on Wikipedia, then the likelihood of anyone jumping out of the woodwork and shouting at me and telling me I shouldn't be using them is very low. Also, whilst I remember, this evening I will be, of course, on Discord for you all to chat to me afterwards if you have further questions and want to chat in a sort of more seminar style. I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think tonight is a turn of the public chat, i.e. the wider one, not the Killick chat. I think the Killick chat is next week's one. But correct me if I'm wrong. I had to skip one last week because of things going on, so yeah. Was it last week or the week before? I think I was there. I was online. I was online last week, so I think I did do one last week. I think it was the week before I skipped one. I'm trying to remember. I'm lost. It's been one of those weeks. I've had a lovely time, but life happens. I think it was. No, it was last week I did miss. It was a live. It was a premiere last week, wasn't it? Yes. Yes, it was. I was back in time for summer, not for Brew Ships, not for the Thursday Live. Logistics is not boring. Logistics is never boring, Steve. I agree, but it's still accountancy is the paperwork side of logistics. You haven't missed anything so far, Mark Harness. So, and that's gone backwards. That's gone forward. So I picked the Battle of Jutland. Battle of Jutland. Right. Now, the Battle of Jutland, historically, there are issues. There is the fact that whilst Engadine, this one, and her short Type 184 do actually get there with a battle cruiser fleet, and they actually launch, radio issues mean no one's hearing them. No one's talking. They're talking away, trying to tell Beatty what's going on, that he's running into the High Seas Fleet, that he's being an absolute but no one's listening to them. No one can hear them. And then we have Campania, which, due to other radio issues, got left behind. Yes. Due to other radio issues, she got left behind. Now, she tries to catch up with the Grand Fleet, but, you know, she's not there at the time she needs to be. So, to get this all to work and be useful, I just need the radios to work. That is all I need. I need radios to work. So, for all this to be fixed, for the Fleet Air Arm to have a dazzling time in 1916, proving themselves to be a critical part of the Royal Navy by just giving information to Jellicoe, all I need is for this to get radio signals at the right time and the radios between ships to work and aircraft to work. So, to our Lord and Saviours, Marconi and Tesla, we do pray. Please, please, back in time where you were, fix the radios and make sure they're being competently maintained. Leaving that to one side, with that all in, leaving that all to one side and the fun and frivolity of that, this is all we need to change. And you can then change Jutland how you wish. To be honest, I don't think it changes the results that much. I think it just makes the Grand Fleet a lot more deadly. Probably allows Jellicoe to refine his deployments just that bit more, which will probably mean the Germans will have slightly more losses. It means he's going to get information about what the Germans are doing with a turn away, whether or not they're launching a massive torpedo attack, or whether they are just, they're going away and it's just the battle cruisers riding in. The thing is, the information comes through to Jellicoe, and that's probably going to allow him to take out a few more German ships. Could well turn Jutland into considering a British victory because of the German losses just being that. Well, as I've done a video before, on what happened on Jutland, etc. The sheer amazing nature of Seydlitz getting back to Germany in the state she's in. A few more rounds hitting her, a few more rounds hitting some of the other ships they have, and they will have lost those ships. There's just no way they survive getting hit any more than they actually are. And the aircraft, if the radios work, are going to account for a few more rounds hitting those two ships. So that's all I'm saying. That will change things. Suddenly, this will be an important part of the Navy, an important part of naval strength. And the Navy will not want to depend upon this on another service. Because remember, the Royal Navy has a history of every time it's depended upon the British Army, historically, the Royal Navy has had issues. They love the British Army. They get them out of no matter what trouble, no matter what they're in, they will go, because it's their tradition. But they have also found historically, whenever they're doing joint operations where they depend on the British Army, they can be, how do I put this, independently minded, which doesn't really help the naval events. And so, I think it's it's highly likely that the Royal Navy would say, under this circumstance, you can have the land-based aircraft. You can. That's important for waging the war. You can combine into a Royal Air Force if you want, but you can't have the ones which are supporting the ships. They have to. Basically, the ship-based aircraft have to be part of the fleet. Basically, the sea is one. Kind of like the mantra of the Royal Air Force, the Naval Air Force, was the air is one, which turned out to be completely twaddled the moment you included anything like logistics. It's a lovely idea, and trust me, I can understand where it's coming from. The idea of the air being one, that no matter where you are in the world, the air is over and it's all one. But the reality was, aircraft need to land somewhere, fuel up, they need to either fuel up on ground or in the air, in which case you need to base those tankers from somewhere which are going to fuel them up. You need to be able to rearm those aircraft somewhere, and that's always on land or on a ship. And this very much starts to break up the aircraft and the air, because you have the different realities of operating aircraft from an air base versus from a carrier and all the other things that go along with it. Very quickly, that breaks up aircraft operations, because the air might be one, but all the surface it's fighting and it's fighting from and supporting itself from is not. Basically, the air becomes one when you're operating from a space-based carrier. When you're operating from something up there, and you no longer have to land on any surface down here, that's when the air becomes one. But at that point, things have changed quite a lot. Okay? Just saying. Now, this, therefore, is the opportunity. And again, you do not have to change that much history. This is one of the key tenets of when I'm doing alternate history is I like to make the smallest possible change to justify whatever change I'm doing. I like it to make it as small and as minimal as possible. And considering this is going to put these things would pull a lot of admirals' reputations out of the bonfires and stick them on the plinths, I have a feeling they would become very protective. You can all feel free to in the chat if you disagree with me, if you disagree that this sort of scenario would not make the admirals support a fleet, want to retain the fleet air arm component under fleet control. Please put the case in the chat. This is reasons why I have the chat open when I discuss these things. But my view is very much if their chestnuts get pulled out the fire by the fleet air arm, which helps turns Jutland into a victory, they are going to be going, no, we want to keep this bit, because this bit's useful for us. They can ignore everything else, but we want to keep this bit. And let's have a look at the chat, because I just mentioned it. If you remember, logistics is especially fun when you enjoy Vol railways. Yeah, that was another thing which caused fun. The Royal Navy had a habit of running a destroyer across the channel with parts when they needed them in emergency from one depot to the other depot. And the army would go, well, why don't you run our parts across into the destroyer? And we go, the Royal Navy went, you never request it. You just bring it across in regular supplies. Did the thingy behind my name change? Yes, it does change at a certain point. As you become a member for longer, the emoji next to your name changes, and the more members I have, the more emojis I can build. I think I've a few members off being able to add some more emojis. That's information is power, yes, but logistics is effect. If you have, you can have all the information you want in the world, but if you can't move anything or do it, use what you have to do anything with that information, it's no longer power. Information information is potential, not power. Power is actually being able to do something with that information. Jacob, I'm going back to school, going to try to get my bachelor's in ship design, maritime engineering, to increase my knowledge and do my job better. Cool. Where? UK or America? Where are you going? You're writing English, I'm presuming UK or America. It could be Australia or once. Just, of course, it's an English-speaking chat, so of course you could be anywhere, theoretically. But if it makes BT look good, he wants it around. Yes. Angelico would kind of love it as well, so both of them were united on that one. That's around. A nice exciting for one. You're presuming that the fighting between the RAF and the RN only occurred in the Cold War. It starts in 1918. Basically, it starts almost as soon as the Royal Naval Air Service is taken away, and it's turned into a fleet air arm. It basically is a whole recipe for a war. So, whatever you might think about it coming in later, it would come in earlier. It was already there. So the idea there's no fighting till after World War II is completely wrong. The fighting was going on. Trust there. This was my PhD thesis, was entirely on naval aviation development, 1920s and 30s. And I ran out of words, so I couldn't include America and Canada, America and Japan in the sort of chapters 4 and 5. I wanted to do sections 4 and 5, but because that would have made it. Well, if I had in those sections as well, I think it would have been 160 odd thousand words at least. As it was 110,000 words, and should be able to be downloaded soon at some point. My honest, forget BT. Jellicoe's undisputed hero from more decisive Jutland. He'll point to Jutland, gave me the information others should have. The fleet needs naval control there. Yep. Nice. Yeah, sometimes it costs a lot of pounds to do something with the information you have. Mm-hmm. So, how will it change history? Well, let's start off with RM will keep those fleet units and bases necessary to support them for the RNS, which it retains, along with, of course, HMS the Furious as she looks in 1918. Yes, this was the height of carrier design in 1918 with HMS Furious. Isn't it wonderful? You have got that superstructure and funnel in the middle of your flight deck. You've got a hangar forward, a hangar aft, and you've got an 18-inch gun aft somewhere. It always gives me a funny turn. Yeah, nice. By the time CVA-1 and versus F-11 in the 60s takes place, the infighting between the Royal Air Force, the Royal Navy, and the British Army has been going on for a very long time. Let's be honest, there's been infighting between the British Army and the Royal Navy going on for centuries, and the Royal Air Force in 1918 do not, just because they're a brand new service, do not get out of it. They're plunged straight into the pool of treasury politics and infighting. Yeah, that's nothing new. So I had them retain their bases in Durban, South Africa, Malta, Mombasa, Kenya, Wales. I fought Fishguard for Pembrokeshire because there's the Pembrokeshire Naval Base. I fought the Calda and Orkney because of supporting Scapa Flow, etc. But I thought you'd also have Newlyn, Felixstowe maintained to support the fleet down south. Malta's going to be the Mediterranean Fleet's airbase. There's probably going to have to be one built in Singapore, etc., to support Indian Ocean, etc. Maybe Singapore, might be Ceylon. But either way, they'll all get there. And those are fairly decent bases, but they're a big drop from what it did have earlier. So if we go back to this is the base list they had in 1918, and this is the base list they would have after that decision. So it's a large drop. It's not me. I'm not sure if she's had her 18-inch gun removed by the time this picture was taken. She might have done, looking at the aft, actually. She might not have her 18-inch gun anymore. But, yeah, she did retain her 18-inch gun for quite a long time. Martinus. Okay, can we please... Everyone keeps picking up on Glorious, okay? And you're going Naval Air-minded captains. No, this is... Yes, Glorious was a bit... the thing is, Glorious stands out because the captain was so peculiarly strange in charge of it and so peculiarly stubbornly wrong. But you have to remember, he is not the norm. In fact, almost any other captain in the Royal Navy probably wouldn't have made the same decision. But again, it's not just on the captain, it's the Admiral who allowed the carrier to go home alone with only 2 destroyers as escorts. In the nicest way, you don't do that with a capital asset. If you think about it, the Royal Navy throughout the interwar period had spent the time training, and you don't do that. When you consider that Courageous had been surrounded by an entire flotilla of destroyers, and still had been, when she'd been doing the anti-submarine warfare patrol and had been lost, sending a carrier home with 2 destroyers as sole escort is not really a sensible thing to do. She should have been saved. She should have been running home at least with a county class cruiser as escort. She should probably have been with the county class cruiser, bringing home the Norwegian royal family, and then she would have definitely had her aircraft operating because the admiral would have ordered it. The odds are she should have been saved for an escort, which would have been a couple of cruisers and about 4 destroyers in there as a task force heading home. In which case we wouldn't be talking about it. So, yes, the captain is at fault because the captain's not flying aircraft, and it's the captain's decision. But the captain's also the captain asked permission from the admiral to do it, and the admiral gave him permission. And at all points, you have a scenario where you would have you have lost out because of those 5 years of officers. Okay. And those officers who would have been in the classes, who would have been part of the promotion decisions, who would have been part of the discussions the fleet's been having, the writings the fleet would have been having, etc. You took out 5 years of naval officers. Okay? You took out all the officers at the various ranks the Royal Navy had going up in its postings in one fell swoop. So you cannot start. You have to start from a very different position than one you're going off when you're thinking about 1939, and you have to almost stop thinking about Glorious, because that isn't really helpful in this scenario, and that isn't helpful as a whole part of the scenario. As important as it is to illustrate things, it doesn't really illuminate much about the wider Royal Navy. And it certainly doesn't illuminate much about the Royal Navy, which had already got an Alexander Ramsay as its 5th Sea Lord in 1938, which had Admiral Henderson, who was the first Rear Admiral aircraft carriers, who'd been its 3rd Sea Lord since 1933, who'd been building carriers and trying to train and change everything and campaigning for the Inskip Award, which happened in 1937. There's the whole wider thing. So yes, you have a navy which is rapidly mobilizing for war and has been rapidly having to put people in places, and this captain is on this carrier. Yes, he's not as air-minded as perhaps he should be. But the thing is, he's what's available. And he's not as air-minded as pretty much any other captain. It's one of the things is, you could have put Vian on there and he would have had aircraft in the air. You could have put pretty much any other captain in the Royal Navy on that position. But I don't want to sort of keep going back to Glorious. We've now gone over this about 3 or 4 times. So, this is what the Royal Navy is building from in terms of infrastructure. These are the carriers they have available. And let's go through the rest of the questions. Similarly, if the Royal Navy keeps the air on, does this affect aircraft and AA tech? Yes, because it's going to affect anti-aircraft tech, and I'll discuss this a bit, but basically, if you imagine one of the problems the Royal Navy has is its expertise on aircraft, etc., are the Air Ministry, so it has to go to them and get any information back through them. That's who officially they're supposed to go to. When you retain this in-house, you're able to go to your in-house people, and they're able to offer their assessments. And one of the problems the Royal Navy has with aircraft procurement and aircraft engine procurement is that they go to the Air Ministry, ask what's possible. The Air Ministry then phase a question out to industry. The industry responds to the Air Ministry. The Air Ministry then rewrites that response to include their own understanding of it or their own view, and they then respond to the Admiralty. So there's a lot of there's about 4 steps between the Admiralty getting the information back from industry. Whereas if you have your own people, then that's the 5th Sea Lord and the 3rd Sea Lord would inquire to industry and then get it back. And you see how that reduces the chance of things changing. So we get a policy of the sea as one, and yeah. Let's see. Anyone with questions around here? Nice to hear everyone. I've just answered those ones. I'm not getting into it again on Glorious. I'm not spending the. We've done a video on Glorious in the past. I'm sure. I'm not doing it again on when we're doing this topic, because otherwise I'll spend the entire time discussing Glorious, and I won't be discussing this. So, Jacob, in the Netherlands, Rotterdam is the only one that offers part-time schooling. Ooh, wish I should be able to combine my merchant navy career. That is a good one, and that's a good school. Sure, I can't imagine after getting the details that someone like this would say anything other than you relieve, sort it out ashore, and maybe it turns out you're moron. I might let you get a ship later. The thing is, again, they're in Norway, so sending him home is the easiest way to get him relieved. Please note that point. You're sending him back to the UK, you're sending him back to your bases where the Admiralty can deal with it. You're in Norway, you're not ashore, you're operating off of Oregon shore which you're fighting over. That's going to affect, and I really don't want to get into a glorious discussion this evening, because that will derail the whole thing. But, you know, you can't, there are far more limited options in the middle of the North Sea, North Atlantic off the coast of Norway, than there are if you send them home. The thing I disagree with is sending them home the way they did. Agreed. Good luck, Jacob, with the degree. So, the thing is, a sea is one policy is going to have lots of impacts just beyond just aircraft. There's going to be no more dual ranks for aircrew, which caused a lot of trouble when the Air Ministry approved ranks for those aircrew. This was the dual crew system, which came in, the dual ranking system, which came in the 1920s, where you would have your substantive Royal Navy rank, but you also have your flying rank, and you could have someone who's a lieutenant commander in the Royal Navy, but who's only a flying officer in the squadron. And you did occasionally have some really weird scenarios where they were technically, because they had more airtime, they were senior as a flying person, as a flying rank, but the person who'd more time in the Navy was senior in naval ranks, but junior in flying ranks, so had to take orders from them, and that would then affect what was considered their command experience and their position. So that could actually alter their projections within the Navy, because they wouldn't get the time they needed in command, because they wouldn't be in command, so they couldn't get promoted up, and this caused all sorts of issues with the officers. So without that, you suddenly no longer have that as an issue for the next. As said, you have that generation of officers back, you don't lose that generation, and you don't have the command and rank structure issues which it causes for the next 20 odd years. Yeah, Washington Naval Treaty we'll be getting to in a bit. Night 6 everyone. Integrated fitters and squadron personnel into the integrated fitters and squadron personnel into the wider navy. Yeah, one of the interesting things is if you start integrating personnel who are squadron crew and fitters into the into carriers, then that's going to affect your carrier crew structure, because suddenly you have these personnel who you can call up, who you will have trained up to help with damage control. One of the ongoing issues the Royal Navy and caused the problem with the Fleet Air Arm and the Dual Air Ministry and Admiralty Control was squadron personnel, fitters, etc., and their abilities to take part in damage control aboard ships, which is a major thing. So again, this caused British crews to often have far larger personnel numbers aboard than they necessarily would in a scenario where the carrier crew and the squadron crew were all Navy. I've missed something from Paul Burswick, I think, somewhere. I'm leaving that one. I'll spot it later. If the sea is one, though, the RN will also need to invest in that. The impact will also be impact the Royal Marines, the Mobile Naval Basing Force, and wider naval strategy. You could well see a far more significant air component as part of the Mobile Naval Basing Force, which will have an impact on things like Crete, etc., because if the Royal Navy has set up its own air bases and put its own aircraft ashore on Crete as part of their naval basing force there, that could well affect the fall of Crete, because if you think about it, if they've already got integrated fighter structure, etc., there, it could change things. Now, admittedly, the army could still come over and start changing who's in command every 5 minutes. That could still happen, but the fact is, if the Royal Navy's operating on a sea as one doctrine, they might have managed to get Crete under some kind of naval control. Always a possibility. Ah. Yeah, I can't see it, Melanie. Can't see Paul's held message. It's also, though, going to make it a more blatant political battle between the Royal Navy, Royal Air Force and Air Ministry versus Royal Naval Air Service and Admiralty over aircraft procurement, with the former trying to control as much as possible because they believe that they can only preserve the survivability of the Air Force by having control of aircraft procurement for everyone, and whilst the latter will use its wider industrial connections to get their own way. Now, what do I mean by this? Well, as I would like to point out, I have strong suspicions about where the Vickers site for things like the skewered dive bomber come from. And the fact is, the Royal Navy spends a lot of money with Vickers developing a lot of visual systems. And that's a lot of money, and I wouldn't be surprised if that helped pay for it. I can't prove it, but the fact is, Vickers is the company which is getting all this money spent with them, and they're able to produce this. Producers. The Royal Navy will also be building ships, and there are some big industrial conglomerates and defence conglomerates who are going to turn around to the Air Ministry and go, we're not, just because you want to control procurement, lovely, but we're not going to annoy the Royal Navy and the Admiralty when they're the ones who are buying not just planes from us, but buying ships, planes, engines, the lot. And this is the thing, the Royal Navy has an industrial procurement system, and are going to be procuring a lot more than the Air Ministry is going to get, and it's going to be a lot more consistently, especially as if you consider engines. We go back to engines again. Motor torpedo boats, aircraft, motor launches can all use the same engines. The same engines can be put in them. So if you consider if the RAF is buying 100 aircraft, well, that's buying 100 engines. Let's say they're buying 200. And they're buying the 200 aircraft, then the 200 engines supported. Well, the Royal Navy will have 4 maybe launches per every one of its large its cruisers and its well, 4 launches for every single cruiser, every single capital ship, every single carrier. So we're talking already about 400. Each of those will have roughly 2 engines in them. Okay, so that's 800 engines, and then oh yeah, they're also buying, let's say, 100 aircrafts worth of engines as well, because they would be in this scenario. So yeah, they're buying now 900 engines plus the spare parts for them. That's going to have an impact on you. That's going to have an impact on the system. One of the interesting things about air engine procurement anyway is we do know that the engine procurement for the Navy pushed up power requirements, especially for motor boats, as much, or if not more, than the requirements coming from the Air Ministry for aircraft engines. And there's the fact that the Royal Navy, because they were concentrating on single-engined aircraft in the late 1930s, and especially after the Inskip Award, when they made the awards for the 2,000 horsepower engines, what would become them, the Griffin and Napier Sabre, which were critical in World War II, they're ordered by the Royal Navy through Ramsey and Henderson, ordering them together. They would basically mean they were ones which got us the 2,000 horsepower engines for the UK, because they were necessary for an aircraft, because an aircraft operating from a ship needs a 2,000 horsepower engine to achieve the desired the power to weight ratio to operate with the modern characteristics which which an aircraft needed, whereas land-based aircraft could do it with 1,000 horsepower. So the thing is, you could well be talking about getting to that earlier. Because again, the sheer scale of engines. Now, this is going to have an impact on 2 areas. It's also going to have an impact, not just aircraft engines and aircraft development, but it's also going to have an impact on Royal Navy's motor torpedo boats. Expect them to get faster a lot more quickly as well. Because remember, I just included motor launches in those numbers. I didn't include any motor torpedo boats. So the Royal Navy adds on some motor torpedo procurement. They're really going to be maxing up the engine procurement. And again, that's going to have an impact on the scope and size of the Royal Navy. Before you start thinking, okay, well, how often are they going to be ordering those engines? They're probably going to be ordering about that level of engines every couple of years, plus spare parts to keep them going in the meantime. So that's going to be a huge amount of engine throughput going through. As it was, one of the big problems the Royal Navy has in World War II is the engine capacity built up to support providing of motor launches, etc., is critical to build up capacity to provide enough aero engines in World War II, which is one of the reasons why the Royal Navy has issues with motor launches in 1941, 42, 42, 43, because they're getting engines for them, because all those engines are being used for aircraft. So again, this is not me talking out of my behind. This is a legitimate thing to go on, and this would be part of the Royal Navy's procurement. So what I see happening is the Air Force trying to control and fighting for control politically, but industry basically going, we can't. And this could well lend to Air Ministry. They could, depending on how they go, they either work with the Royal Navy over it, or they then start focusing in on the groups which don't supply the Navy with engines and don't supply, and they go, we're only going to give our aircraft contracts to you, and other industry players who the Royal Navy gives contracts to are the ones the Navy gives contracts to. Which could be very interesting, because if you think about it, there are four of the major air companies are pretty much kept going through the 1920s and 30s by Fleet Air Arm procurement. And to an extent, they are... Hawker is sort of to an extent, but... So they're sort of the fourth, but Blackburn, very much kept going by Fleet Air Arm procurement. Fairey, Fleet Air Arm procurement, and more interesting not, Supermarine. So I think you could end up with Supermarine, Blackburn, and Fairey basically becoming de facto Royal Navy suppliers, with the Royal Air Force going for Hawker and probably a few others. But it's going to be interesting because, again, could mean Bristol engines, and therefore Bristol aircraft could theoretically go naval way, because Bristol engines are often used by the Royal Navy. Hi, Sean. Joe, any thoughts on Royal Marines with leader armor relations? Early experiments with artillery spotting, fortification gas. They tended to get on quite well, but that's not really today's topic. But yeah, they tended to get on quite well, and they worked out quite a lot. There's also some very interesting things in the defense, in the various defences of Antwerp, etc., in Belgium, that go on in World War One. Oh, question. Would there be enough production capacity of both services buying individualized aircraft? There would have been. There was enough production capacity, definitely, for them to have individual aircraft, and they probably would have been doing. Besides, de facto, that's what they did throughout the interwar years anyway. The aircraft the Royal Navy were buying were very different from the aircraft the Air Force were buying. Occasionally, you would have things like the Hawker Hart light bomber / dive bomber, which we used, turned into the Hawker Osprey and Nimrod fighter for the Fleet Air Arm, but that's sort of it. That's the commonality. New York 4472. The Royal Navy has a precedence for taking rocks, small islands, and treating them as ships, so turning Crete into HMS Crete to stop the Iron Making Messings wouldn't be impossible. No. It's a possibility. They would be better off, nicer, in working with the RF with the RN on engines, but it's how would they do so? So, then we have the Washington Treaty. Well, this was an interesting one, because this is what it is built as standard. You have 135,000 tons of carriers based on 5 27,000-ton aircraft carriers. No limitations on carriers under 10,000 tons. Allowed to build 2 carriers overweight as long as they're conversions. And, of course, I've got Hermes as an example sitting here. Now, I started thinking through, what would be a Royal Navy's reaction if they're obsessed with observation? Well, then I started thinking about the original designation of Hermes, which was a sort of scout carrier. Okay. So this got me into thinking about the admirals. And as said, the admirals are strike carriers. Now, in this scenario, it's not a strike which has caused the preservation of a carrier of naval aviation. It's been its reconnaissance capability, its observation capability. So, I'm not sure about the admirals. I don't think they would get built. Here is what I think Beatty would fudge along the lines of. Because Beatty's going to stick with what he knows. I think it's going to be scout cruiser carriers, i.e. Hermes starships, and I think Courageous and Glorious would get converted rather than the admirals. However, I think there are a different set of limitations. So, to support this, I think the Royal Navy, knowing the value of smaller carriers and aviation spotting, gets them categorized in, which almost did happen. Okay, this almost happened anyway, and the figure they were looking at depends on the source you're reading, whether it's 11 to 13,000, so I've gone for 12,000 tons, but there are some sources I've read which suggests almost happened anyway, that there was a subcategory of carriers in the Washington Treaty. And I've then gone, right then, so if we've got a 12,000 ton category for smaller carriers, then you're going to raise up. Now, originally, it's below 10,000 tons, you can do whatever you like with it. Okay, so I used that as my ratio to 27,000. Well, that's about 2 3/4 times that limitation. I didn't want to go that high, because 2 3/4 times 12,000... that would take it up quite a lot. That would take it up to all of 33,000 tons, which is bang on near the battleship limit, the capital ship limit, and I didn't want to go that high. So I thought 30,000 tons would make sense. So that's 150,000 tons for fleet carriers. And scout carriers. I gave them 10. With 120,000 tons, because again, what would the Royal Navy want them for? And thinking about it made sense, because if we're going to keep to the existing ratios, not change anything else, 5-5-3 sort of 2 ratio sort of thing going on, that works. Now, they might use the scout carriers for seaplane tenders, they might use it for any sorts of things, but there are options, and I think the fact is that if we consider Hermes, she was capable of being used as a seaplane tender. She did have the facilities, so she was a flying on, flying off ship. But primarily they wanted the flying on, flying off ship because seaplane ships have a problem. They have to stop in the middle ocean. This was even realized to be a problem in 1918. So I have no qualms in saying they wouldn't. Now, don't worry, George. We're then sort of talking about the IJN. Well, I thought they would get free 12,000 ton and free of the 30,000 ton vessels, so they get 90,000 tons, which is an improvement. Originally they get 81,000, so this will be 9,000 more tons for them in carrier construction capability, and 72,000 tons, so 12,000 ton vessels. Again, this could be an interesting one for them. It could be interesting. And then France and Italy both get two 30,000 ton vessels. And, well, here was the interesting thing. Originally, they do get 30,000 tons anyway. They get 60,000 tons anyway. And as I said, with 27,000 tons new limitation, that's not going to produce you anything more than 2 carriers and 6,000 tons over going, what do you do with it? So I put the extra into their scout carriers and decided to just give them 60,000 tons of scout carriers, so they each get 5 of those. The question is, would they build anything? Would they build something? You never know. What would they build if they had that as the limitation? I was tempted to go with a limitation of... theoretically, I should have gone for 4, right? For the scout carriers, so that would be 48,000 tons, and I just decided 5 makes more sense than having that extra. I wasn't sure how much tonnage I'd give them, because they get an extra, well, they get an extra 6,000 tons on the 54,000 tons, so basically I should have taken 60,000 tons and given them an extra 9th, and an extra 9th of 60,000 tons. Well, it's a little bit over 6,000 tons, but again, it's about 7,000 tons. But you can't do much with it. You can't do much with it. That's the point. And so it's a case of, right, now just add into the scout carriers. It just made more sense. Seemed fairer. So this is going to make things interesting because, again, the Royal Navy has interesting statistics going on. But again, the Royal Navy has interesting statistics. So does the US Navy. US Navy could build scout carriers. The thing is, would they build them? Would they build them? What would they do with their fleet carrier tonnage? It would actually make things a lot easier on the Lexingtons because they wouldn't be quite so overweight compared to their official limitations. Let's be honest, they and if you consider the conversions might still have, you're allowed to build heavier on the conversions anyway, as you traditionally were. I think originally you were allowed a fairly larger weight on the conversions. I think they're allowed to be up to 33,000 tons, if I remember correctly. So that's 27,000 tons original. So that's 2/9 greater. So what's this? 36,000 tons. They could probably they could get the Lexingtons in underweight and still have them fitted as they like. Scout carriers is going to be the interesting one. What do US Navy do about scout carriers? Whether they build or what they build will be an interesting one. Well, if I show you the Royal Navy, once I started figuring out the Royal Navy, I thought, what did the Royal Navy have that fitted into this? Well, the Royal Navy has Hermes, which fits in at 11,000 tons and 20 aircraft. We'll talk about the US ones. Yeah, you don't see Ranger as it was. No, you've also got a scenario that suddenly your carrier numbers, your number of carriers, is no longer dependent upon your, you want to build a carrier swarm, fine. You can build your 10 scout carriers. And so suddenly, if you think about it from the US Navy point of view, Lexington's become their scout fleet carriers. Well, in this scenario, they could have 10 smaller carriers for their scout fleet, which means Lexington's, what do they become? Are they scout carriers or are they strike carriers in the main fleet? It can change your entire doctrine. You could end up with them organising battle groups in World War II where they have a light carrier, scout carrier, with each of the main carriers, and it's up to 12,000 tons again. It's all an interesting possibility. Now, the Royal Navy under this scenario, I've left them with courageous and glorious. The Royal Navy ends up with 109,750 tons out of the 150,000 tons allocated in terms of these ships. And they end up with 11,000 tons out of the 11,020 tons out of the 120,000 tons allocated for their scout carriers. Now, for scout carriers, they can choose what they want to build, but honestly, I could see them trying to keep with Hermes class and keep building 11,000 ton ships so they're under the weight, and maybe thinking they can sneak in another one, claiming it's going to be it was only 10,000 tons. I'm not sure how they would do it, but they would approach it. Interesting enough, Argus, well, she's 14,680 tons, so she's going to count towards the fleet carrier tonnage. But again, Article 8 has remained, and Article 8 does allow for all carriers which are under construction, in existence, or building by November 12, 1921 shall be considered experimental and may be replaced with the total tonnage limit prescribed in Article 7 without regard to its age. So for the RN, basically that means Hermes, Argus, Eagle, and Furious can all be replaced as and when they wish. I think there are lots of options for the US Navy. I think, like with the Royal Navy, there are lots of options. I would think you would see things like the Hermes carriers, the scout carriers. I had this feeling that they would get used for places like the South Atlantic, for the China station. I wouldn't be surprised if you ended up with a couple of them out there. And it could be really kind of interesting what would happen and how they deploy them. But I think they would be more often than not visible in places, like visible in terms of in places of like the sort of distant stations. I am in two minds as to whether or not they'd be operating in the Mediterranean. I was sitting there thinking, okay, would I have 3 sitting in the Med? I don't think I would. But I might have a couple sitting in Med. I'm tempted to have 5 pairs around the world. Far East, Indian Ocean, Mediterranean, South Atlantic and North Atlantic, and have sort of 5 pairs allocated off. Sort of home fleet, all those sort of things. And then have the fleet carriers allocated to the home fleet and the Mediterranean fleet as they were historically. That would certainly be what I'd be tempted with. But I could, of course, focus them. I could put 3 in the... I could combine sort of the carrier squadron for the Far East and base it on Singapore and maintain a carrier in the ocean and carrier in the China station with 3 based on Singapore, with Singapore facilities supporting them. I could then base 3 in the sort of Mediterranean and have them as the permanent force rotating in, wandering around there. And I could have the other remaining 4 in the home fleet and have them covering the South Atlantic from the home fleet. So you can do different things with them as you need. I would envisage scout carriers operating with cruiser squadrons, but doing the presence mission. They would be on the presence. They would be on the presence spectrum, and you would be looking at 20 sort of plus aircraft, 24 aircraft probably. Now, why does this make sense? Because in this scenario, you're looking at aircraft primarily as a scout, reconnaissance, and spotting asset. Okay? Remember when we're talking about the Swordfish? Swordfish has a really interesting designation. It's a torpedo, spotter, reconnaissance. TSR. Now, if that was in alphabetical order, that should be RST, shouldn't it? Reconnaissance, spotting, torpedo. But it's not. The TSR is in importance to the Royal Navy. Torpedo? Yay, it's a torpedo strike aircraft. That's its primary function. Spotter? That's the function we're talking about here. And then reconnaissance. So I have a feeling TSR would be the aircraft designation you're going after, and most of those escort carriers, most of these carriers which are scout carriers, would be festooned with TSR aircraft. Now, Hermes might need better machinery if they're going to be operating with cruiser squadrons, but their top speed of 25 knots means that she's more, and her cruising speed means she's able to keep up with them cruising. And it's her aircraft which are going to reach out for her, not the she's not a strike asset going to go and fight the battles. Hermes herself would probably be left the same, but they might well evolve the others up. And if you think you've got an extra 1,000 tons to play with, and a knowledge you can develop, I think you would do so. In fact, I came up with a sort of Hermes class, and I thought, you keep a momentum of roughly one a year, one every sort of 18 months, one every year to 18 months coming out. These would be the allowed major new construction, because let's be honest, you can build cruisers and you can build these. You don't have much other construction going on. So the Royal Navy will be concentrating going, right, and we can build the counties and we can build these. So they're going to be building one at a time. And each vessel will be a little bit better than the previous one. So it's not going to be massively expensive. Again, this is something which people are probably going to go, how would the Royal Navy afford it? How could British government afford it? Well, if you're just building an extra carrier a year, an extra small carrier a year, in terms of the Royal Navy budget, which is not exactly small, this is not going to cost a lot of money. And I expect they would be slowly improved. So I wouldn't be surprised if the speed started to went up slightly, and other things went up slightly as they got better. And again, you've got up to 12,000 tons. So you've got an extra 1,000 tons you can play around with. You're going to get experience building it. I wouldn't be surprised if superstructure and things change. And so the Hermes class, the last one you get. And remember, you can even replace Hermes herself because she's experimental. So if you start construction of these in 1921, etc., you could build, another 10 of these, and you could start, you could have them all out by 1936, 1934, 35, maybe, and then you'd be starting a new fleet carrier construction. So the things that go on become Ark Royal, Illustrious, etc. equivalents. So this is something which could be very, very useful for the Royal Navy, and probably useful for the US Navy, and that it would keep up a drumbeat of construction and allow them to develop and refine their ideas. So the carriers you would see at the end of the cycle would not be the same as the carrier you had at the beginning of the cycle. Now, scout carriers are not part of the cruiser tonnage. They are their own separate branch. And this is the point. It might affect the RN's calculation of how many cruisers they need, because it would make their cruisers more effective, which could affect the later London negotiations. But honestly, you cannot really predict that far ahead, okay? In terms of treaty negotiations, because if you've had this many more aircraft carriers in service and the experience, more air-minded and more integration between aircraft and cruisers in terms of their operations earlier, by the time you get to the London Treaty, there might be a very different modus operandi going on. So it's going to have a ripple impact. How big an impact is going to depend on how effective those cruisers are in our exercises. Paul Westwick, at that size, would they have common machinery counties? Well, that will be quite an obvious thing for the Royal Navy to save money on, putting in common machinery between the counties, between them and the counties. So they might well have that facility in them. I doubt they get 8-inch guns, though. Would the small tonnage size lead to earlier development of deck-edge elevator lifts as aircraft size increases so that aircraft numbers to be kept up? Potentially deck-edge elevators for the British could be implemented earlier. But you have to remember the reason the British are so slow when it comes to deck-edge elevators is because of operating in the North Sea. And the idea that water getting into your hangar is not a good idea. Operating as often as the British do in the North Atlantic, the South Atlantic, and the North Sea gives the British an idea that waves coming into your carrier is not a good idea, and into your hangar is not a good idea. They experienced this in World War I with some of the lovely seaplane carriers, and they really didn't like the idea of water getting in there, which is probably why the British were quite so closed off to the idea of deck-edge elevators for a long time as they were. But you're quite right in saying that aircraft sizes are increasing, and if they want to maintain air group sizes, they might well try deck-edge elevators, deck-edge lifts, which will affect the wider British design, and also affect the air group on later British carriers. So it's half a dozen one or six the other. I wouldn't be surprised if deck-edge elevators were involved, but I'll be talking more about that when we get to the larger carriers and the probable impacts on them. Can't have sure. Going to have to rewatch. The 5-month-old decided to be fussy all day. Dad crashed hard when she went down for a nap. That's fine. 5-month-olds come first. They always do. So I'm also getting the impression the Iron was thinking they were getting one over on everyone with inventing light cruisers and making them seem worse than heavy cruisers. The British had all sorts of ideas. On the question deck-edge list, is this why the 1952 fleet carrier designs and even the CVA-1 retain their near centerline lifts? Yeah. Basically, British worry over salt water. And honestly, if you consider there are some really cool photos of the waves in the South Atlantic in 1982, and literally Hermes and Invincible both disappear behind waves at various points. The waves are that big. And you sort of understand where the British were coming from. The British had this fear of them. The thing is, there's also going to be a lot more carriers in service for the USN and the IJN. If you consider, I guess, again, under this thing, the IJN can build more carriers, the USN can build more carriers, France and Italy could build more carriers. It could be very interesting. I don't know if Italy does build aircraft carriers, even with this advantage. I don't know if they do. I would like to say they do, but I don't know. With the French would still have the burn. Would they build some smaller carriers? They might do. Instead of their seaplane carrier, they might build scout carriers. Which would be an interesting prospect if the French built smaller carriers instead of building the seaplane carrier. So that could be all sorts of things. Why have they changed my buttons around? Anyway. So, new build fleet carriers. Well, this is going to be another interesting area of a differential because historically the RN pitched 22,000 tons, HMS Ark Royal, 23,000 tons, Illustrious, to try to get 6 out of the 135,000 ton limit. Okay? You start working out and you go, oh, hang on. Yeah, you're trying to get roughly 6 out of this 135,000 ton limit. Because if you think of 6 times 22, that's 132,000 tons. Okay. 6 times 23 is 138,000 tons. Alright. So the British are trying to get 6 carriers. Why do they want 6 carriers? Because they're looking at it and they're looking at where they need to base them. They think they need these 2 of these big carriers for the home fleet, 2 for the Mediterranean, 2 for the Indian Ocean at any one time. Far East. So they need 6 carriers. So under this one, 6 carriers would be 25,000 tons. And of course, they're going to have the 10 other carriers, the 10 12,000 ton carriers, or maybe 12 10,000 ton carriers. You never know how the British will play it. Either way, the British could well be going, right, what's that? That's 25,000 tons. So it could be an Ark Royal size carrier with an illustrious style armoured deck and maybe even deck edge lifts. If built to the same design, you could have 2 or 3 of the same class could even be in service with the retirement of Argus and either Furious or Eagle, thanks to their experimental status, on the Ark Royal timeline in 1938-39. So you could have 2 or 3 vessels which look like this, with armoured decks in service. Now, that could be highly interesting. Would they be better at submarine strength? I'm not sure. But here's the thing: there was already somebody who's pointed out Ark Royal went, well, you know, they might be better protected against submarines. Remember, with Ark Royal, the problem was the damage control officers were damage control officers, but they didn't come from. They weren't as experienced in carriers. They weren't as experienced in carriers because of the losses of Courageous and Glorious, which had been in the previous model. 2 of, well, if you consider Argus hadn't been in operation, Ark Royal had been. So you've got Ark Royal instead of Argus. So that's 2, 4, 6. You have roughly 7 carriers in the Royal Navy, which are most, and 6 carriers. You've lost 2/3. You've lost 1/3 of your carriers, and 2/3 of your 2/3 of your major fleet carriers have been lost at the beginning of World War II, with all those experienced officers going down. Now, in this scenario, you would have had maybe you still had those 6 vessels, but you'd also had possibly as many as another 9 scout carriers. So suddenly you've got 50. You've got maybe 16 vessels, 16, possibly even 12, 10,000 vessels. In which case, you might have 18. Who knows? Vessels. So you've got all that many more officers who are experienced in damage control. So think about it. If you're looking for a damage control officer for HMS Ark Royal, where are you going to go? Are you going to go to capital ships, or are you going to go to one of the smaller carriers and promote up those officers? You're going to go to the smaller carriers and promote up those officers when you're short of damage control officers. You're going to go to the people who've already got experience, and you're going to have a far larger pool of officers who've gone through damage control and worked on damage control on aircraft carriers than you have, because you're going to have all these more carriers, and you're going to have a far larger pool of fleet air arm pilots and fleet air arm personnel to call from. So you're going to have far more experience, so you're far less likely for it to be sunk due to damage control mishaps. You're also unlikely to lose Courageous and Glorious, because if you think about it, Glorious, as mentioned, might have better operations and security in terms of her personnel aboard and the command and understanding of her, but Courageous is unlikely to be lost, because if you've got small carriers, a surfeit of escort carriers, of these scout carriers, which are these smaller vessels, which are you going to send anti-submarine warfare hunting? The 12,000-ton carrier or the 24,600-ton carrier? You're going to send a 12,000-ton carrier. You're going to keep the fleet carrier for fleet duties, and the scout carriers are going to be doing the anti-submarine warfare duties. So yes, you might lose some of them early in the war to submarines. You might not. Again, there's going to be advantages with being smaller and being potentially more manoeuvrable, and all those things going on. But the fact is, you're unlikely to lose fleet carriers. Now, this is going to have an impact on the wider war, because you're more likely to have Ark Royal survive, you're more likely to have Courageous survive, and more likely to have Glorious survive for longer, which means you're going to have those larger carriers longer in the war. My Highness, did the IJN try to pretend Surya is a scout carrier? Trust us, she's 12,000 tons, not 14. Probably. They probably do. They might try and get a few carriers in under the 12,000 ton limit. I think you probably wouldn't have ski jumps because you have the catapults. Or rather, as they're called in carrier terms, as accelerators. Catapults are what are fitted to ships like cruisers and cruisers and capital ships, you know, battleships and battlecruisers, to launch aircraft. Accelerators are what are fitted on the front of carriers to launch aircraft. Sure, Mac, if the French get serious about carriers, I think the Italians will build at least one so they can say they have at least one. Probably. Friendly Seaman, my money is on multiple burn casts. Then they have to convert multiple of those battleships. Okay, they convert one into the burn. I hope they don't do a second one. It would be sacrilege. Could the conversion to all welded save enough weight for another hull, or was that a more technology timing issue instead of just resistance changed by designers builders? Again, if you've got more ships being constructed, you're going to slowly increase the amount that's being welded versus being oh god, goodness, riveted. And so, actually, the more construction you have going through, the more power and influence you have over builders and designers, and also the more likelihood you learn lessons and you're able to do it. So, whilst I wouldn't be surprised if the first few are riveted, I wouldn't be surprised if by the time we get to the last ones of the scout carriers, they are all welded, and I wouldn't be surprised if this means Ark Royal is all welded. It's interesting. Thailand, does American and Japanese naval aircraft technology change, or just the British? Their technology is going to change as well to adapt to what the British are doing. Please note, they're not in closed ecosystems. They're all looking at each other, so they're all going to be changing to an extent to adapt to each other. I just am not getting into the changes of the American and Japanese because that would take me. To try and work that out, I'd have to work out what intelligence information they get under the historical analysis and how that affects the decisions, and then work out what intelligence information they would get under this new circumstance and how that would then affect and feed into it. And that's so many feedback loops that I am then off to the races of basically historical fantasy. And there's nothing wrong with historical fantasy. We all love to read a good historical fantasy book, but it's not what I'm doing here. I'm trying to do alternate history, so I'm trying to keep it as close to one topic as possible. And the change is literally, what's the change of having the fleet the fleet units stay as part of the Royal Navy in 1918? And the easiest reason to justify that is reconnaissance capacity and spotting capacity at Jutland, and the effect that would have on a battle, and therefore go from that, go forwards. Okay, spotting and reconnaissance are now the emphasis, so they're going to want to push those, which means smaller carriers are going to be critical for that, as well as having fleet carriers for strike capacity, because they're already developing Cuckoo and torpedo aircraft. So that feeds that. They were already having those discussions at Washington Treaty, so that's filtered into, and now we're building on from that. So everything has a logical train. Well, the point is, HMS Unicorn was 16,770 tons in standard. I wouldn't be surprised if under this circumstance you don't get Unicorn built or developed. And there is a reason for that. Because if you have all these 12,000 ton ships going around, you probably would use that hull as your basis for it. Now, this could be interesting if we consider the light fleet carrier, etc., and the things that come off it. If you don't have Unicorn in service, but you might well also develop Unicorn anyway. But also, one of the reasons Unicorn is developed is because you're having to build armoured carriers to get the armour aboard, and they aren't able to have the same depth of aircraft numbers aboard as HMS Ark Royal. Well, now if you have all 25,000 ton carriers, you don't need Unicorn because they're all Ark Royals with armour. And if they're Ark Royals with armour, they have the Ark Royal aircraft capacity with armour. They might even have deck-edge lifts, because as you pointed out, if you keep building smaller carriers, an aircraft size you only want to maintain your air group, you move to deck-edge lifts. In which case, you could have an arc roll which has an even bigger capacity because of its deck-edge lifts, so an even bigger theoretical aircraft could be carried on board. So you would therefore have armoured flight deck, and you'd have deck-edge lifts off to the one side. And you still have the spacing, etc. inside, but you just have the holes for the aircraft to get in and out. Steam catapults are developed in the 1920s, 30s anyway, Blackburn Maximus. They're already there. That's what's being... Accelerators are being developed, and they are steam. That's what they're working for. It takes a while to get up to the steam catapult as we would understand it, but they're working through them. They start off with some variants of hydraulic ones, and slowly they work up to steam. So that already happens anyway. I doubt it would happen any earlier. Inns Morrison's seaplanes, flying boats. Well, the seaplanes that the seaplanes that fly from aircraft, from ships, etc., would still be flying from ships. So they'd still be part of the Royal Navy. The ones which are the Coastal Command are part of the Royal Air Force. As I said at the beginning, basically, under this scenario, those things which operate from ships go with the fleet and stay with the Royal Navy. Those which don't, that operate from land bases, go with the Royal Air Force. Nice to remember, we haven't got into World War II yet, so please don't bring up Denmark Straits just yet. I know it's your favourite. I do realise knew you were going to come up, bring it up, and I've got stuff prepared for that. But we haven't got to World War II yet. We're still going through the carriers, and we've got to go through aircraft as well. So we've got a long way to go before we get to there. Because, believe it or not, this is quite a big question to deal with. Now, when you start thinking this all through, you start realizing very quickly that you're going to be changing quite a lot of history. But it's a viable history. You've also got to think about what size the American carriers are going to be, because if they can build them up to 30,000 tons instead of 27,000 tons, their carriers are going to get even bigger, as are the Japanese carriers. So, whilst you might well see the Royal Navy build their dream armoured flight deck carrier, you might also see the Americans and the Japanese build their version of an armoured carrier. You know, we live in this world where we consider it almost unique. The British go for the armoured carrier, the Americans and Japanese go for the large air group carrier. Well, under this scenario, you can achieve a balanced carrier on 30,000 tons, which has both armour and a large air group. You're going to go for that. So you actually might see more similarity between the different naval air services than you do historically. Conversely, you might not. You might see the Americans go for an even bigger carrier, and the Japanese go for an even bigger carrier, with an even bigger air group. You might. I cannot 100% predict which way they go. No, new IKB 472. They don't. Nicest way, they operate the aircraft they need from ships. They're not going to come up with a new way to keep flying boats. I'm not going to add that in because that would be cool. Again, that's adding in extras to history, which this is supposed to be a sort of, as I say, I always do with alternate history. It's an examining of the existing history and seeing what decisions were made and why they made decisions they did. It's very interesting once you go through this and you're going, right, and so we've got 30,000 tons. Okay, so the Royal Navy, the whole thing of HMS Unicorn doesn't exist, which is really annoying from the light fleet carrier perspective, because she's Genesis for that program, which is really important for rapid production in World War II. But there again, the Royal Navy would have a existing design of these vessels, which they have a practice design in place for 12,000 carriers of up to 12,000 tons, and they would have a fleet carrier which had Ark Royal size in terms of air group, but illustrious class in terms of survivability. You combine those two together, that's going to be a pretty darn good a carrier. It's going to be an interesting one. I think the trouble is if Australia getting a scout carrier or all the other things getting a scout carrier, if they do, those are going to be from the British limitations. So you have to remember the British under the Washington Treaty, London Treaty, and all these treaties, they are limited in those ships to the ones which the raw. It's not just the Royal Navy limited; it's the Royal Navies of the combined Royal Navies of the British and Dominion fleets are limited by those treaty limitations in terms of their cruiser numbers, in terms of their capital ship numbers. So the Royal Navy was specifically limited because the Americans were worried about them just giving capital ships off to the Dominions and going, well, they're not ours, so they're not affected. We're not breaking the treaty. We've given them to Australia. So it's the same with carriers. So yes, Australia might have one, might have two, but the thing is they're going to be operating as part of the wider Royal Navy service, and it depends if the Royal Navy is going to keep them in. And again, I'm not getting into that because, yeah, that's pretty much an audacious class, isn't it? How do I put this politely? It's pretty much an implacable class, is what we're talking about. If we're talking about 30,000 tons with the air group of Ark Royal and the armour of an illustrious class, but you're probably also dealing with the fact that they're probably going to have the same hangar sizes, hopefully, as the Ark Royal. So the Ark Royal is quite a tall vessel because it's double hangar, it's massive hangars, and the hangar height. So that's going to be the interesting thing. But yeah, you're talking about something which is 30,000, 25,000 standard tons. You're pretty much talking about an implacable, implacable, indefatigable, and implacable. And the British will probably fudge that a bit as well. I always try to be I'd always try to be honest. I try to be polite because, as a rule, and I'll always operate with my policy. My students I will be sarcastic with, but I will never be rude to. I don't believe in being rude with them. Sarcasm, well, I'm a British university lecturer. It's Britain. Sarcasm is one of our forms of communication. It's not rude. It's expected. If your lecturer is not sarcastic occasionally with you, then people start to worry about the lecturer, whether there's something wrong with them. It's almost expected, the sarcasm. But the rest, I try not to be rude when I'm in teacher mode because I don't think it helps people learn, and I don't think it creates an environment which allows people to exchange and learn. And the whole point of learning is an exchange. Don't worry. So let's talk about ship design of the wider fleet, because this is something which is going to be quite interesting to me. I was tempted to put this after aircraft design, but I decided to put it in this point because it follows on from carrier design. So here's the thing. The Royal Navy now has control of its own aircraft, so it's going to develop its own dive bombers, etc. when it wants to. It's going to be not, the Skua will not be the first generation dive bomber. That will be, if there's a dive bomber built at the same time as the Skua, it'll be about the second or third generation dive bomber in the Fleet Air Arm. It's the same with other things, which is going to have an impact on the development of gun mounts and air defence, because suddenly Britain's going to have all these aircraft involved, and aircraft and realities of them. Now, they might still have the same confirmation bias come through from exercises. That could still be the case. However, I don't think you end up with things like dual-purpose mounts on destroyers, which can only go up to 55 degrees. I think they probably go up to 70. Maybe they go up to the 85 degrees, but I think at least 70 degrees. And that's going to have a big impact on World War II. Okay? You have more ships going through which have these more versatile mounts which are able to mount a better defensive aircraft earlier on. So they're not reliant just the moment on that point on their pom-poms, but their main guns can also keep firing. They're probably going to have increased number of pom-poms on as well. And yes, suddenly the Royal Navy goes from being actually the Royal Navy goes from being what is on paper the best equipped navy in terms of pound per pound for anti-aircraft fire in 1939 to being actually well equipped for anti-aircraft fire in 1939, because the Royal Navy is paranoid. You have to remember, with the losses of Abercur, Crecy and Hogue, the Royal Navy has become paranoid about losing ships. Okay? Yes, losing them at Jutland was bad enough, but Abercur, Crecy and Hogue, the loss of them has left the Royal Navy with a paranoia which it never gets over. It's still, to this day, if you want to make Royal Navy officers shudder visibly in front of you, you say to them, Abercur, Crecy and Hogue, like that, and they'll go, ooh. Because that is the thing it's left in there. Even officers who don't really know what you're talking about just go, ugh. What did you say? Why? That is the lesson, okay? So the Royal Navy is paranoid about air defence, as much as it can be. And it builds it as best it can with the information it has available coming from the Air Ministry, the influence it does have within its own fleet air arm and the information and feedback it has from that, and its exercises which produce their false positives, where everyone's going after the carriers and the capital ships because those are the things which give you the most points in exercise, so everyone wants to win the exercise, so they go after things that give you the most points, rather than in wartime when you go after whichever target you can get your hands on. And you feel strong and confident enough to go after. And basically that can be a destroyer. So the reality is it's going to change things. So the Royal Navy is going to be better at air defence. Is this going to have an impact on the war? Yes. How much of an impact? I can't really say. But I have worked through in the past and done videos about what would have happened if these had been true general purpose mounts. I did a whole video on it on 4.5 inch or 4.7 inch, and if it had been a true general purpose mount, how capable it would have been. And the rough idea I came through was the Royal Navy loses a lot less destroyers, and as they lose less destroyers, they have cumulatively more force available, which means they lose less again because they have more firepower when they need it, which means which is basically the thing that works through. And again, it's going to be the same with the carriers. As I said, you know, you're unlikely to lose Courageous and Glorious earlier on. You're unlikely to lose Ark Royal. But if you think about that, if you have Courageous and Glorious, you're likely to have, and maybe an Illustrious class, which has a bigger, HMS Illustrious, which has a bigger aircraft capacity, which you would do, something along the Ark Royal level of aircraft capacity, you start to think about what would happen at Taranto. Now, you have more aircraft involved at Taranto. I've done that in other videos of what happens at Taranto if you have more aircraft. I've discussed it when I've discussed Taranto. And you suddenly have a lot more Italian naval losses. The more ships the Italian Navy loses, the less effective they get in the Mediterranean. And that's going to have a big impact on the Mediterranean Fleet War and the war in North Africa, which is going to have ongoing impacts on things like the positioning of force in the Far East and how many forces can get sent out to be the Royal Navy's Force C. All those things are going to have cumulative impacts. So you get very quickly in this war, you get beyond what happens in World War II because of the cumulative effect, because of this change. Blackman Maximus. What about rotating Dominion crews through the fleet air and provide experience, like the Commonwealth Training Program? They would probably have been doing that anyway. That was, if you consider the way the fleets were integrated, they would have been part of that from the get-go anyway. Knew I could be 4472. The scout carriers suddenly grow an armoured belt when the war starts. It's going to be amazing, but they might have a similar evolution as the county class, because if they're built alongside the county class, all sorts of things could be included in them. Paul Bestwick, wouldn't a 12,000-ton scout carrier grow naturally with a follow-on class after the first batch reach completion in the early 30s? Not particularly, because remember they're limited by treaty. So they're limited to 12,000 tons and they're limited in numbers from the get-go. So they can't really grow naturally. There is an artificial limit going on. And as said, they're going to, basically they'll be built in ones. So it'll be built as a class, but it'll be like the Hermes, the county class or the town class, you know, where their batches are very different, and even individual ships are slightly different. Slight evolutions going on here. Sure, mate. The only reason the Iron doesn't have far and best way destroyers in the world is the issues with the 4.7-inch guns. I would say the 4.7-inch gun mounts, not the guns, the mounts. And the mount and the angles the 4.7-inch guns can go to. Yeah, with torpedoes and everything that could work, they would be really fun. Yes, Blackburn Maximus, I do get my dream dual purpose 4.7 inches, and my tribals become far more potent and powerful. Then we know tribals lost the aircraft. Gurkha will not have to charge them alone, or if she does, just imagine the aircraft she'll take out charging them. Goodness gracious me, that will be a ride of the Valkyries. HMS Gurkha returning to fleet. I have sunk the entire German Air Force. No, I think they have a few more aircraft than that. I have sunk the most of the German Air Force. How? Well, after I got fed up with taking out these over our convoy, I went to Germany. Okay. I went through the Kiel Canal and I tracked down their aircraft. Okay. Gurkha, come back to fleet. Return to fleet. Stop it. And why did we give you a symbol which has two Kakuris on you? No. Stop it. Come back. But no, seriously, with the dual 4.7-inch guns, they'd be far, far more powerful and far more capable in terms of their security and their defense at sea. Nice one. Let's see. MERS, the demise of the French Navy. Taranto is an Italian massacre. Denmark Strait. Yeah, it's going to be an interesting scenario. So, basically, what you get is you get better dual-purpose mounts for destroyers. Probably everything else stays pretty much the same. Honestly, the same things are going to apply. So the dual-purpose mounts are going to improve. And you're going to have more aircraft carriers. And those aircraft carriers, especially the large ones, are less likely to be sunk doing things like going off solo or anti-submarine warfare patrols. You might lose the small ones doing that, but you're unlikely to lose the larger ones because they're unlikely to be deployed doing that because you've got the small ones. Again, why would you send a fleet carrier off on anti-submarine warfare hunting when you've got scout carriers? You're not going to. You're also going to think about this also well from scout carriers. You're going to have them involved in convoying from the get-go. And there could be a really interesting scenario where the government, as part of their program, starts a crash scout carrier construction program along with the sloops, the sloops that are, of course, the Flower-class corvettes and the Hunt-class escort destroyers. So you could have a scout carrier program being started at the same point. And this might actually also be, these might also be built in Canada and other places as well. You might get them being built in Canada and Australia, because especially if they use cruiser engines and cruiser tonnage, they can, cruiser sort of style construction, they can possibly be built in those places. Sure, I'm just imagining certain US admirals trying to steal tribals for their carriers, certain US admirals trying to steal their tribals for their carrier task forces. I have a feeling a fair number would quite like them. Paul Westwick, with you saying that individual ships are closed, I can see one being built at Camelaires, which was 60 foot longer and 2,000 to 3,000 tons heavier. Again, they wouldn't be allowed to by treaty, but it could be Camelaires will be the ones building the 20. And again, remember, Camelaires are the ones who build Ark Royal, so I wouldn't be surprised if they use their experience to build an even better Ark Royal. As I said, an Ark Royal with an armoured flight deck and an arm around her. Scout carriers service CVEs until the USA pumps them out. Does the USA ever pump out CVEs? And again, you're thinking about them still producing escort carriers. But if you've got scout carriers and you've got a scout carrier design, they wouldn't be CVEs. They'd be a scout carrier design. And they might already have a design ready to go. It might be the kind of... You're looking at... You're thinking of it as a scout, as a CVE. Think of it more as the scout carrier, the escort carrier being the equivalent of the Flower class to the Black Swan class sloop. So the scout carrier would be the Black Swan, the military version, and there would be a civilianized version built based on it. So our entire idea of CVs would probably change. They'd probably be bigger from the get-go. Would there be a scout carrier with a plate? Probably. In the nicest way, the likelihood is that all the hunting groups would have a scout carrier or a carrier with them. And 37, 38, Paul Westwick, there is still treaties. You know, the Royal Navy does not... The British government... the Second London Naval Treaty is 1936. The British do not formally ignore the treaty until about 1938, late 1938, early 1939, because they're trying to get Japan and everyone back into it. So the odds of the British jumping ahead and starting to build such a ship is unlikely. Oh, I expect these things to have two quadruple pom-pom mounts at least, or something like those things. Scout, so Count's carriers just effectively fighter cover and scouts. Scout carriers will be probably, first point, they'll be designed around this. So they'll be designed around probably an air group of roughly 24 of these. Now the thing is, at a certain point, there's going to be, hang on, we're going to put fighters aboard them, especially, you know, at certain points they're going to start thinking, let's put fighters on them. And that's going to change the air group composition again. But it's going to be interesting if they're designed around torpedo spotter aircraft, they're designed around the largest aircraft you have available. So fighters, whilst they also grow in size, it's going to be a case of the fighters are going to take, even the later fighters are going to take up, broadly speaking, the same space as the TSR. So, yeah. But expect scout carriers to be organised around this. So they will have aircraft which can do torpedo strikes, spotter rolls, and reconnaissance. So they'll also be able to do the anti-submarine warfare patrols. So I would expect to see most of their air groups being swordfish or equivalent for a long time. Now, the interesting thing is, what happens with the Fleet Air Arm maintaining control, or the Royal Navy maintaining control of engine production? And how much more powerful engines do you get? I think, again, the Royal Navy is going to be pushing for power because the whole problem is that throughout the 1920s and 30s, their aircraft are going to be short on power. And they're going to know it. And they've got control, remember, of procuring a large number of engines. So they're going to be pushing the power envelope. How much more powerful does this get them? Does this get them to 2,000 horsepower engines in 1938? I wouldn't like to say that, but I think you might see them on things like, there's already been someone said 1,600. My idea would be about 1,500, 1,600 horsepower engines would be the standard engine ratio being fitted in about 1938-39 to aircraft. And I wouldn't be surprised if you have that pretty much universally across the board. So for the Royal Navy. Now, you would have those, the thing is, the advantage for the Royal Navy is they would have those engines in pretty much everything. So motor torpedo boats, hello, a lot more horsepower. Everything will be done to maximise the power-to-weight ratio of the individual engines and the aircraft involved. So we'd be looking at something which would be really a lot more powerful. Now, this is also going to have an impact on other things. Now, remember when I've talked about the swordfish? It's party piece, and the reason why it's so effective at attacking fleets in harbour and ships is because it has the special systems to keep its torpedoes level when it drops them. On this picture, if you look, you cannot see where the system is. It's been carefully scrubbed out of the picture, but you can see where there's been scrubbing marks on the picture if you look. And you notice there's the cap and the shape of the cap on the torpedo. So, as I've said before, it is wooden extra fins on the back here to extend this, like it was fitted to American and Japanese aircraft and German, but also a tension cable on the front, which comes down to keep in just enough tension to make it belly flop in the water. Now, to do this, you need to be able to fly and get it properly done, low and slow with a very high degree of accuracy, which is why you build a biplane. Now, the thing is, the British are still going to want to do that, and especially do long-range flights at night. So do they do that with a more powerful engine? They might well do. They might well still have a biplane, but it might be a more powerful biplane which can really zoom. So basically a swordfish with a far more powerful, with an engine which is twice its power. Could well be what you're talking about. But under that scenario, you probably also have the swordfish would have to have a canopy fitted, because it would be able to go higher altitude. It would also be able to go faster. And again, the Royal Navy would still be pushing for ease of maintenance and the ability to operate on the far side of the world, because those things aren't going to change. And you're probably still looking at a 3-person crew, because you'd want a navigator and a pilot as standard. And for some operations, you want a telegraphist air gunner as well, because you want an extra pair of eyes for things like if you're doing anti-submarine warfare patrols. And these scout cruisers are going to be heavily involved in those duties. Okay? They are going to be heavily focused on that. So this aircraft type is going to be critical for that, and they are going to be critical in that. And also, before you start thinking, why aren't you having fighters? Well, if you think about it, if a scout cruiser is operating in the Indian Ocean, where are they likely to come across enemy aircraft that need fighter protection? Unlikely in the Indian Ocean. In the South Atlantic, unlikely to find fighters. Even in the North Atlantic, they're unlikely to find fighters. Yes, you can say, well, they could be fighting Americans on it. And in those scenarios, you change your air group. And you have some fighters you call in, and probably you would do. But the thing is, you're unlikely in most of the scenarios of them to have it. The one area where I think you would have fighters included as part of the aircraft as standard would be in the Far East, because I think the carriers which would be deployed to the China station would have fighters as well as TSRs aboard them. Okay. Did I just go off sort of on a long one for you all? I know this is going to be quite long and quite a heavy discussion, but I wanted it to be a fulsome discussion for you all, so I have been prepping for this for well, luckily the not sleeping thing helped a lot, the prep. So, Mac, well, when you reach 1940, scout aircraft more and more means something like Dauntless. By 1940, a carrier scout aircraft that can't strike is an anomaly. Well, the Swordfish would be to get to go from the get-go. You could see some very powerful engines. If you think about it, let's put it this way. If the Royal Navy is developing those engines and it's got pushed up and it's pushed it up with Airtsecure, the Air Ministry is also going to be taking advantage. The Air Ministry is not going to be sticking behind on slower engines because they want to. The main reason why the Air Ministry doesn't push as hard on new engines as the Royal Navy does, etc., is because they're pushing for most of the mid-early 1930s. They're looking at multi-engined aircraft, so they get their power-to-weight ratio by carrying multiple engines. And they're looking for engine for that sort of scenario. They're looking for a power with the engine. They add in that. And they're also, it's going to sound strange again, their single-engine aircraft don't have to be as heavy, because they don't have aircraft which are single-engine that carry a torpedo. They don't have single-engine aircraft which have to carry all the gear a naval aircraft has to carry, because naval aircraft has to carry the survival gear for the crew aboard. You know, the boat, all the extra stuff, all the extra locating equipment, etc. they need to carry as standard. So those all make naval aircraft a lot heavier. Plus, a naval aircraft has to be designed to deal with that controlled accident, which is landing on an aircraft carrier. Because let's be honest, that is a crash. Yes, you get caught by cables. When they sort of design them. And originally they are cables which are designed to stop the aircraft landing and going off the flight deck either side. Eventually they're ones which are designed to stop them rolling forward. And yes, there's a crash barrier and all sorts of things, but it's a crash. And so you have to design a far more heavy-duty aircraft to take this. So that has an impact on the weight and your durability of your aircraft. So all these things are why you require more power. But the whole more power is going to leach into the Air Ministry's aircraft procurement as well. So you'll have Spitfires and you'll have Hurricanes, if they're procured, or whatever their equipments are in this timeline, with with 1600 horsepower engines, etc. as well. Did you just attempt to apologise for giving extending explanation of the reason for your loss? This is the whole reason for this channel like this. Yes, but I also do not like to go off and wander or bore anyone. I have had a couple of comments lately that my comments on my occasional presentation style is a little meandering, and I don't like that. I don't like to be thought of me as meandering. I'm trying to keep, broadly speaking, to point. Sometimes I get incredibly distracted by some very good ideas, but you know, I try and keep, broadly speaking, the point. And then we have the dive bomber. Well, the Blackburn Skewer has a history of being the most accurate dive bomber ever produced, but also being the most useless in so many ways because it didn't have enough power, and honestly, it's the first generation, and by the time the Royal Navy actually gets in a scenario where they actually will be using it, they no longer have it in service. It's really annoying that way. Minnesota, do you have by chance have photos of the system used to keep the torpedo level during transit from aircraft carriers to water entry? I don't have pictures, but I do have diagrams somewhere in my PhD thesis notes. Somewhere. I hand drew them myself based on the description that's provided because I couldn't find them. So they are terrible, but they're there. The aircraft, so the reality is, with the Royal Navy in control, the Royal Navy starts asking for a dive bomber to be developed about 1926, 1927. So, therefore, by about 1939, you'd probably be on dive bomber generation number 3. A, you'd have more powerful engine, and B, you'd have the third generation of dive bombing site, third generation of dive bombing crew, all those things. I would expect these aircraft to be showing up on the fleet carriers. I wouldn't expect them to be on the scout carriers. I'd expect them to be showing up. I expect them to be the major difference between the fleet carriers and the scout carriers. I'd expect, as I said, I'd expect the scout carriers in the Far East to have fighters aboard. I wouldn't expect the scout carriers in the Indian Ocean or in the South Atlantic or North Atlantic to have fighters aboard. Interestingly enough, it is a potential possibility that the scout carriers, if they're in the Mediterranean, might have dive bombers aboard, but I doubt it. I think dive bombers would always be the smaller group because of the way the Royal Navy operates, especially with the idea of night strikes, etc. Dive bombers and night strikes are a bit of an interesting mix because it's such a visually orientated attack methodology. And doing it at night is interesting. You can do it at night, but you basically need someone to make sure the enemy ship lights itself up like a Christmas tree to make it viable. So basically, if you're doing a night strike operation in terms of dive bombers, your technique usually is to try and send in things like fighters with rockets first. They do a strafing run, try and hit things, set things on fire, but also cause all the air defences to light up, all the searchlights to come on. And when the searchlights are on and they're firing their guns into the air and all the tracers going everywhere, boom, 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 that's when you swoop down and you attack them with the bombs. So, again, I think it's more of a fleet carrier operation, and I think it's more something the Royal Navy has for attacking fleets in harbour, etc. And I think, again, this is going to have an impact on things like Taranto, etc., if they're carried out, those operations, because you'll have dive bombers coming in doing the bombing attack, and the TSRs will be able to focus on the torpedo attack, and that's going to have an impact on what happens to the Italian fleet. You probably have something broadly similar to Stromax, so you'd have something broadly similar performance to Dauntless, but optimized for our specifications. Potentially. Potentially. No, those comments don't come from people in the chat, but it comes from some of the people who watch the videos afterwards. I know. Well, it also comes occasionally from academic colleagues who watch the videos. But we don't need to get into it. Chomac, you also need someone who's willing to pitch into a 70-degree dive when they can't see anything. Most combat pilots are brave, but that is another level. Yes, that is pretty much a level beyond what you would normally aim for. Now we get into the fighter. Well, here's the scenario. If you have a scout reconnaissance fighter, i.e. a Fulmar type, / strike escort fighter, now she's limited. She's got the 1,000 horsepower engine, and that really makes her slow. But otherwise, if you look at the Fairey Fulmar, they're a surprisingly successful aircraft. But you also have that Gullwing Seafire scenario sitting up there. the gull-wing version of the Spitfire, which was sort of the Type 224 / other types being developed at the time, fought by Supermarine for the Fleet Air Arm. Now, the point is, you would more than likely have a decent fighter in service with the Royal Navy because they'd have been procuring them they'd have been procuring them as part of a constant drumbeat. You are going to have a problem, though. And there is a small problem, because the better performance and better, more capable fighter you have at the beginning of the war, the more likely, especially if the Battle of Britain takes place as historically, the more likely you are to run into issues whereby the Battle of Britain is coming first, so the Royal Navy doesn't get to develop its next generation of fighter. So it starts off really good in a fighter in 1939, but by 1941 it's a frigating terrible aircraft because everyone else has been improving and it hasn't. Now, there are scenarios which work around this. For example, if, the Royal Navy pushes through and gets it produced in Ceylon, modern Sri Lanka. Now, why would I say this? Because the Royal Navy did at times have ideas for setting up its own external aircraft procurement. And if you look at how it operates in terms of Australia and Canada, in terms of building its ship stores and infrastructure positions around the Dominion fleets, it does have a habit of setting up satellite production facilities for things abroad. So there is a scenario whereby the Royal Navy could say, look, we're building up for an Eastern War against Japan, etc. We want to set up a satellite production facility of spare parts or things in Ceylon. Now, again, historically, this is something which I'm not talking out of my behind on. They did have discussions about this. None of them went anywhere, and those discussions are often rather junior individuals involved. But it's not pushing it more of a sort of a strange scenario. If these were more internal discussions rather than discussions with another organisation, i.e. the Air Ministry, there are odds on, and the Royal Navy's already got a larger, stronger, more important air group, air section, which is part of its wider fleet operations, and they have more aircraft. This is a scenario which I could see happening. I'm not sure what kind of components we'd see built there. It might be just spare parts, but either way, you might have less of the issues you have in World War II with getting spare parts for the Fleet Air Arm. And you would also have a better fighter in service. Now, again, what are the knock-on impacts going to be? Well, the knock-on impacts of those fighters are going to be felt over Norway. Okay, they're going to have an impact in Norway and on the operations undertaken there, and that might again. The thing is, if the Royal Navy has more carriers, the odds are they have at least a scout carrier out watching Norwegian coast. And they had cruisers out watching Norwegian coast, but they missed the Germans getting into position. But a cruiser can see a lot less when they're trying to keep distance than a scout carrier can. Because a scout carrier, the aircraft fly off and they can be well beyond the visual range of the Norwegian coast and well beyond range of running into Norwegian patrols, but their aircraft can wander around and keep spot on what's going on. So this could change the Norwegian scenario. I will get into this, but there is that real possibility. But it does present an interesting thing for the beginning of the war in the Mediterranean, because again, if you've had more carriers involved, then you're going to have a very different strike on Taranto. If you've got more fighters out there and they're better fighters, they're going to have an interesting impact on the attrition and losses suffered by the Royal Navy at various points. And the thing is, Crete might not even happen, because again, one of the reasons why Crete takes place the way it does is if you consider the Germans were pretty much losing until the Italian amphibious forces start to show up. Yes, they had a good few days doing severe damage to the British, but the British were starting to turn it round when they got resupplied, and that basically finished off the British in Crete. If the Italians have lost sufficient capital ships and sufficient force structure, they're not going to attempt that push. If they don't attempt that push, then the British don't lose Crete. These things are all various scenarios which carry on, but they change World War II. We're in a very fluid scenario. Don't worry, Melon 6040, I enjoy it when you're saltier than normal. Sure, Mike. There is also a large tradition of the Dominions working hand in glove with the Royal Navy, so you're more likely to get some local participation. Yes, for example, when the Royal Australian Air Force is being set up and it's hunting for aircraft, it might well pick to build a local version of the Royal Navy fighter instead of going for the Buffalo. In which case, that would then create another source of spare parts and fighters, and it would be an interesting scenario. What could go on? There could be a lot of multiplications of this. Blackburn Maximus. What about manufacturing our own aircraft in Canada? Well, that could also be the case. But yes, you can get the stuff to the Atlantic Pacific coast. But from the Pacific coast, can you get it to Australia? Can you get it to the Mediterranean where you need it? That's the question. You have to get it across. You have to have the shipping to get it across from those points, and that's potentially viable, but that's still not going to be easy. Thank you, Tobias. So yeah. So basically, fighters. Again, the Royal Navy would actually have. The Royal Navy had a fighter program. You have to remember there are fighters. The Royal Navy does have fighters. They have the Nimrod, the Osprey. They have all sorts of aircraft they're developing, and they have plans for aircraft. They just get interrupted by 1939 at the point of transition. And the thing is, if you don't have 1918 and you're not rebuilding from basically scratch, as we're finding out today, rebuilding our fleet air arm and our carrier strike force from scratch, you have a different cycle. So there would be a different cycle, there'd be different aircraft available. They would be stronger. So, Clarke, how's the UK economy going to source enough engines? Well, one of the scenarios, as I've pointed out, is the Royal Navy would have been ordering more engines to begin with. So you would have a greater peacetime infrastructure to build from. So, again, you have to remember the Royal Navy's building those engines in peacetime. And they're growing the resources and materials in peacetime. In war, it's one of those things. We often talk about wartime production and how they expand in wartime. Remember, they're expanding from baseline. So if your baseline is here, to get to here is a massive effort. But if your baseline is here, to get to here is not as much effort. But you're probably going to go up to all the way up to here is the same amount of effort. So if you raise that baseline anyway, you are therefore going to give yourself far more capability to expand from. So this is one of those scenarios. Again, the Royal Navy, with the way they're ordering engines, they'd be ordering them based on a sort of, as they did traditionally when they could order engines and they were ordering engines, they like to order them for everything. And so they would be investing, and so they would be upgrading infrastructure, etc. Or rather, the infrastructure built in the 1920s and 30s, which was built historically to support naval aviation, would be built differently than it was originally built. See, we don't have that limited a pool of engineers to man the engineering base. Again, it's one of those things, that number isn't limited. You can grow that number, you can train more. And again, we're talking about a process that's starting from 1918, with the drop of the fleet, with the Royal Air Service, which was a massive organisation. Yes, instead of it doesn't all get lost. You know, the Royal Navy keeps quite a large chunk of it, and in this scenario, they keep a chunk of it. So they have their own engineers. Plus, if you have more construction going through, you're going to keep more engineers in the engineering base, and you're going to be training more by those big companies. This is one of those things. Again, we talk about the sort of the naval infrastructure. It'd be amazing at the effect of those carriers, those scout carriers being constructed. Those are basically the size and the equivalent of an extra cruiser being constructed each year. In 12,000 tons, a cruiser's allowed up to 10,000 tons. So you've got basically the equivalent of an extra cruiser being constructed each year, and you've got the ability to build maybe 9 of those. Well, 12,000 ton ships over a 12-14 year period is going to have a massive impact on the amount of marine infrastructure which survives those periods, survives the interwar period, survives the 20s and 30s, and it's going to expand the number of people available. And as Sean Marks pointed out, expanding a run is much easier than starting one. There is all the reason the USM was able to grow from planning 18 Essex class to 33, where you had a lot more trouble going from 0 to 18 carriers. Exactly. So it's one of those scenarios. The more you are building, even if it's only a small increase in peacetime, the easier it is to expand and cheaper it is to expand in wartime. Okay, does that explain it, Steve? Or do you want me to do some more? Because that's one of the glories of Battle Lives. I can ask that question and go, have I managed to explain it, or have I not? And while you're answering that, I'm going to get some 1901 out. You see, Steve, at that point, and you are right, your dad was starting his apprenticeship in 1938, and companies at that point were still recovering from the 1933 recession at the time. That's true. But the companies wouldn't have dipped as low in the 1933 recession because of the construction, but they wouldn't have been as low as they were before. You have to remember, they'd already suffered damage before the 1933 recession because of the massive drop in Royal Naval construction than was normal, and the massive drop in orders than was normal. So you would have more going into it, and so they'd have more security in before the recession. They'd have had a better position before the recession, and they'd have had more construction going through the recession, which would have meant they'd have survived far better, and so they'd have been starting from a larger pool when they're recovering in 1938. They'd have been at that place that much further on. So the thing is, this is the point of when you change the history. You're changing something at the beginning, and yes, you're right about the economics as historically they are. They would still have suffered, but the point is they'd be suffering. Let's say historically they're at this point, but under this scenario, they'd be at this point. So let's say they suffer, and they both you suffer a 50% drop. So drop from this to 50% screen is down to here. 50% here is down to here. And then they're building up from that point. And so that allows them to build up greater. So this is the point I'm making. Contra-rotating propellers are something which come along when you have far more powerful engines. So whilst theoretically they could come earlier, I have a feeling they won't come before you get to 2,000 horsepower engines. The Baldwin government actually spends quite a lot on infrastructure. They do, but I think the trouble, but also you have to remember they are building up from a far lower cap. One of the problems the Royal Navy has in 1938 in infrastructure, remember Henderson's been going around spending money since 1933 investing in infrastructure, is what they're building from. So it's not just the Baldwin government. You're dealing with several successive governments which have been trying to build up infrastructure and trying to build it up. But the thing is, it had been dropped to quite such an extent, because whilst the British had structured the Treaty of Versailles to completely destroy the German marine infrastructure, which it did successfully do, which is why German construction is always such fantasy land and naval in their plans. Because they're basing it on their theoretical ability to produce ships, and then they look at their realistic ability to produce ships, and they realise they've lost pretty much everything. And they're having to build up from zero. The Royal Navy has, historically they dropped, let's say, down from a 10 to a 3 in what their construction. Under this scenario, they dropped from a 10 to a 4. So between 1933 and 1935 really, and 1940, they double. So they get back to a 6. That's still not anywhere near the 10 they were. But if you've dropped down to a 4 and you double, you get back to an 8. Again, still not near the 10, but a far closer. So that's what I'm talking about. And yes, you have a limitation in terms of numbers of engineers, but you also would have had more employed the whole way through, and more consistent employment, and more stability. So that would actually also make it cheaper. One of the things is, if you are building up, again, if I'm building from this level to something, let's say that I am building up to, I want to double my capacity, that takes me to there and costs me this much. But if I'm building up from this level, and I want to get up to here, that's again doubling my capacity, but that's probably going to cost me the exact same amount because of where I'm starting from and the amount I need to invest to grow that. Stu Vanguard, 1600 horsepower probably engines, and probably there'd be Bristol type engines in a sort of Gullwing Spitfire in this scenario. That's fun. Same here, though. Good thing my wife can stand it, and some has some of the same interests. Only 40k is right out. She's still looking for a partner support group. Actually, on a serious level, I do know of one, because one of my best friends is actually in a legitimate 40k partner support group, and I find it funny, and I go, look, in the nicest way, you're not a. The exact expression I used when discussing was, "You're not dating anyone at the moment," and she went, "No, but all my friends are in a support group where we get together and we have where they want to have get together and chat about their partners who are 40k fans." And so I went, "Who do you use as your example?" She went, "Well, I use my male best friend." I went, "Oh, great. So you mean you use me?" "Yeah. Thank you." I then had to ask a clarification. "So we aren't dating because I don't remember this." And she went, "No, we never have and never will." "Thank you. Just checking." She's a very good friend of mine, but she is an absolute hates war, hates anything to do with military history, hates anything sort of 40k and all that stuff. And I sometimes do wonder why how we are so good friends as we are. But the phrase I will just use is university, and we like the same movies. I did read your message, Melanie6040. I'm not reading it out loud, but thank you. I did read it. It was very nice. Okay, I understand your point, but I think from my limited understanding in 2030s, it seems your economic scenarios have been ambitious. Okay, right then. My economic scenario and where I come from 2030s did include going back and rereading the British Historical Statistics by B.R. Mitchell and redressing it from that, but also from reading the various studies put together by the Admiralty and their own systems. Now, the point of making it, and I don't want to go into too much data because we're talking about the various naval atmosphere, is that it will seem it seems ambitious when you're based on experience of what actually happened, but you're changing what actually happened. So you're changing it so that the Royal Navy is investing in the 1920s when they don't have the economic crisis. They still have cuts, but the same amount of money is going in, but instead of that money going through the Air Ministry and going through all sorts of weird processes before it comes out, it's going straight from them between the companies. You've also got investment in more ships being built, so you're going to be investing in infrastructure. That's going to support them, which means in 1920s, that's going to be more about retaining existing infrastructure, because you have to remember there is attrition of infrastructure in the 1920s from the World War I high. So in the 1920s, what you'd mostly be doing is just maintaining more infrastructure, and which means you keep maintaining that, and it's more expensive to build new infrastructure than it is to maintain infrastructure. So this is the reality of when you're looking at the 1930s and you're looking at the existing 1930s, you're talking about construction of new infrastructure, still based on the template of the old infrastructure, but it's still construction of new infrastructure. It's not quite as expensive as building stuff completely brand new, but it's still more expensive than, oh, we've maintained this infrastructure and we just want to improve it. But if you want to go read it, this book is an absolute beast. But I do warn you, this is, as I was saying earlier, accountancy history. This is the full stats. And this will go through everything from the British statistic history. It comes out in updated versions roughly every 5 years. I've got another 2 of these actually somewhere. I love them. They are wonderful. For me, for most of my period of history, I don't really need to bother about getting the new ones because the new ones include the stuff right up to a current day. But you can go through this and you can see Well, let's put it this way. It's got the industrial statistics. And this is called Miscellaneous Industrial Statistics. And it is entirely the ships built and first registered in the British Empire and Great Britain from 1787 to 1818, in the United Kingdom 1814 to 1870, and all ships built in the United Kingdom for British citizens and companies from 1870 to 1980. So you can take this and this one. This page alone is 1814 to 1938, and it gives you the total number of sailing ships produced and their numbers in 1,000 tons. So you can see how steamships are built and all ships cumulatively, sailing ships, etc., how much are built and what their tonnage is. And that tells you a lot about the stats about what's going on and about what's going on in the shipyards. And the big thing is, again, in the shipyards and what affects engineering numbers and is especially important for apprenticeships, is because of the drop in construction. Who are the first group who suffer? The apprentices. You get rid, in a nice way, they're the cheapest, but also the least the group who know least. So you usually get rid of your first year apprentices quite early on. Your second year apprentices, etc., will be kept. But this is what causes the trouble longer on in terms of the engineer production. And as you're pointing out again, engineers. Now, one of the tricks that the Royal Navy had was if they were ordering ships from yards to keep the yards going, they would instruct and require they keep the first years going. Why were they doing this? Well, because the Royal Navy is looking at this from their perspective. The yards are looking at it from their own financial perspective. They want to deliver the ships they can build as efficiently and timely as possible, with minimal union disruptions. The Royal Navy is looking at it from the perspective of they want to maintain the capacity to construct ships for decades to come. So there's a differential in how they're ordering. Civilian orders will prioritize cost and efficiency. Naval orders will often prioritize other things. Sure, I am led to remember the yards that went out of business in 19 because there weren't enough orders. Pretty much. So that's the RN lost the yards in 1910s. But think about the yards which were kept open by the sheer number of orders that were going through. Again, if they could, the orders that going through, they could have kept a lot more companies probably viable and going, and larger. It is of course cheaper to maintain operator Lingnair Mansion than it is to operate to build a new Lingnair Mansion. Yep. So I'm gonna put this book back up there. See, this is the thing. This is why historians have so many books around us, because the sheer ability of us to answer questions by just going, right, and here's the book, here's the stats in there, let's use it. Oh, it's fun economics. Anyway, so the Battle Atlantic. Now, this is a big problem for the Royal Navy, and again in World War II. This is something which causes a huge manpower suck. Huge crew suck. Don't worry, Tanif, take care. Because of the near number of people you need to do it. Now, start thinking about this. Even if the Royal Navy does lose Norway still, under this scenario, they might not again. But the point is, when they do, if they get into the Battle Atlantic, you then have all these scout carriers around, and some of them could well be used as escort carriers. Now, if they're used as escort carriers in the convoy program from the get-go, this is going to have an impact on submarines. Because A, the escort carrier is going to be in the center of your convoy, and they will have guns on them. So if your submarine tries its trick of going up the center of the convoy, which is one of the favored ones for you all to talk about, because of course it's eventually worked out actually by people back home doing intelligence analysis, going, this is the only thing which fits with this pattern of attacks. They were going up the center of the convoy. They'd go up the center of the convoy, and they'd find a scout carrier going, "Hello, have you met my 6-inch gun? But I have a pop-pop on the front, and that can sink ships, merchant ships." "Yes, but I have a 6-inch gun, and probably by this point a 4-inch armor belt. So yeah, bye-bye." But more importantly, the aircraft going around the convoy, flying off from the convoy, they're going to keep the submarines' heads down. Submarines come up the surface. Yes, they're only dropping maybe 100-pound bombs because that's what they have to develop. But those 100-pound bombs, those submarines are going to want to go down, which is going to cause an attrition rate amongst the submarines. But it's also going to mean the submarines are going to be even less effective while they're in their smaller numbers at the beginning of World War II than they were originally, which means supplies are going to be getting through more easily early on. Now, this has a cumulative impact. The longer you can go before you start having stresses on your industry due to supply shortages by severe disruption of convoys, the stronger your industry gets. Okay? It's a cumulative thing. The whole of war is a cumulative action. This is one of those things which is often forgotten. Wars are long term. So the Battle Atlantic will have those convoy carriers, those scout carriers in from the get-go. There's also the point that actually as part of the initial war emergency program, yes, capital ships and carriers might still get paused. Churchill's still coming in. I don't think naval aviation is going to change that. But as part of the emergency program, more scout carriers or escort carriers, which would be civilian, as I said, would be to a scout carrier as a Flower class corvette is to a sloop, i.e. they would be, what do we need to do to scout carrier role in the required merchant hull, would possibly be under construction. In which case you would have that surge of escort vessels coming along at the same time. So they probably enter service in about 1940, 1941. Again, the parallel with the submarines coming in, the larger numbers of submarines coming in from Germany, which means that the Germans would be dealing with it. There would never be this air gap in the middle Atlantic. There would be a consistent air support the whole time. Yes, you might still want to put aircraft in Iceland. You might still be worried wanting to put them in, in the Azores and those places. You might still do those required operations, but you're going to be less dependent on doing those kinds of operations. There's also going to be a bigger problem for any German surface raiders from the get-go because, let's be honest, Graf Zeppelin, not the Graf Zeppelin, the Admiral Graf Spee, the Deutschland, etc., they are more likely to find that there's a scout carrier around looking for them. And if they are spotted by a scout carrier, they're going to find it far more difficult to get away. Because the scout carrier is going to call in the cruiser hunting group. And again, the problem for the Deutschland and the Admiral Graf Spee is they can't outrun British cruisers. They're not fast enough. So those cruisers, as long as they know where they are, can form up on them. Which means they could well get packs forming up on them. So you could get things like the Deutschland and the Graf Spee sunk earlier on. It's also a case of if Scharnhorst and Gneisenau go out hunting again, there's going to be more carriers around. There's going to be more scouting aircraft around, which are going to spot them further away. Well, no, I don't think that. But if we consider, I'm basing them, of course, on HMS Hermes. Which, of course, she was armed with 6 single 5.5-inch guns and 3 single 4-inch guns as originally built. I think probably as she'd enter World War II, she'd probably have 6-inch guns and 4-inch guns, or maybe all 4-inch guns. I'm not sure how they would, but either way, they would probably be enough to deal with a submarine on the surface. And as History Vanguard points out, they might just ram them. Let's be honest, this is the Royal Navy. We have the Royal Navy has the history of being the only navy which a battleship has sunk a submarine, and it was HMS Dreadnought which sunk a submarine by ramming her and then reversing over her to make sure she was sunk. Steve Clarke, so war escort production could be needed less because scout carrier could pick up U-boats at greater distance. Yes, and also there is another scenario, because if you think about it, condors, which are often used for to help wolf packs find their targets, they could be picked off by fighters, and radar-armed scout carriers with radar aboard and fighters could be taking out the condor aircraft a long time before they get anywhere near to reporting where the convoys are. So this is going to all have a cumulative impact on the convoys going down, which is going to have a cumulative impact on the wider economy. Michael Gooch, scout carrier versus pocket battleship. Yes, it will be called up the cruiser scouting route, but they probably launch a torpedo strike while they're waiting for a cruiser to appear. Yeah! And that's your other problem, because, it's got 24 of these aircraft aboard, and, well, there's going to be a couple shadowing you, and what are the rest of them going to do? They're going to go back and go, let's load up with torpedoes! Have fun times! It might be a squadron, it might be a squadron and a half, 3 or so flights coming in, so you could have 18 torpedoes being aimed at you. And that's just nasty. Mental note, Wolfpack tactics against CV escorted convoys. They are Wolfpack tactics versus the escorted convoys are a lot more dangerous for the Wolfpacks. You also have to remember, one of the main reasons the Germans start to develop the Snorkel, the Type 21, etc. submarine is because of their need to get submarines in underwater and to stay underwater because of the presence of aircraft, especially aircraft from the convoys, but also the wider patrolling aircraft. So if you have escort carriers from earlier on, though, that's going to suggest a problem for those submarines. It's going to take still a long time for the Germans to develop that technology. So yes, there will be a response from the Germans. They will probably develop the Schnorkel and things earlier on, or rather, they acquired them from the Dutch. They are probably going to try and implement them earlier on, but it's going to take time for them to get there, and they're going to lose some of their better submarine commanders while that's going on. They're going to lose some of their more experienced submarine commanders while that's going on, because basically attrition is going to demand it's going to take a percentage of them, and they're going to have problems earlier on. And it's going to get the, let's put it this way again, it's a cumulative impact, because it gives the Royal Navy more time to build up. So before the Germans get to their peak strength, it's going to delay the Germans getting to their peak strength and enable the Royal Navy to get to their strength earlier, which might allow a very different Battle Atlantic. It would still be hard fought, it would still be a bitter campaign, but it would be a different campaign. So, if CV scouts are a thing, do the Panzer Chief get built as they were? Well, the Panzer Chief are basically the best things the German Navy can build at the time they're building them, so they probably still do get built. As I've said before, the limitation on the German construction is not their imagination. The limitation on their construction is their industry and their actual industrial capacity of what they can build. So yeah, they might be slightly better in terms of air defense, but I'm presuming they'd still have those huge 11-inch gun turrets, still have 2 of them, and still be structured in the broadly speaking way they are as giant pyramids. So yeah, I doubt much would change. You might not get, let's be honest, the sheer number of aircraft which are involved in sinking Yamato are quite massive. That you might get those sinking of the Yamato style, but you might also get the Deutschland, etc., getting damaged, and there might be another strike launched in on it, and it might get sunk or it might be severely damaged. Either way, it's going to have a nasty bump. Let's put it this way: think of it more as Bismarck style. It's damaged, and then something nasty turns up to make sure it doesn't get away. Steve Clarke, the Kriegsmarine has to react early, seeing the UK has more aviation vessels in its fleet historically. So will you see a response in German aviation ability? I honestly don't know, because again, if the Germans prioritize the same construction as they did historically, and let's be honest, they fetishize the big gun to their sort of, if you want a true battleship navy, you look at the German navy in terms of surface construction. I don't think the Graf Zeppelin can get built, because again, the limitation is their industrial capacity. So the Graf Zeppelin probably still gets the same point it does. But you never know. Someone might actually finish it off. But even in that case, if it is built, it gets to meet the sort of the new armoured Ark Royal style super carriers. So that's really not a good scenario for it. For let's be honest, Graf Zeppelin would have had enough trouble fighting an illustrious class, aka HMS Victorious. HMS Victorious with an Ark Royal style air group with dive bombers, etc., which work, is not good for a Graf Zeppelin. At no point is that a good scenario for a Graf Zeppelin. So I don't think it really helps matters. No. Blackburn, no. I don't think there'd be a Kiev light scout carriers with angled flight decks, and there's no. The technology to develop angled flight decks and the need to develop them is not around in the 1920s and 30s. It's just not there. Friendly Seaman, Rodney would materialise out of thin air. Yeah, I think Rodney could be going very fast. So, the Battle of the Mediterranean. Well, this is an interesting one, because again, if Taranto is turned into a much bigger destruction, and especially if you have dive bombs involved, dive bombs are the one thing which might actually do some damage to the Gilo Cesare. So there is a possibility the Gilo Cesare actually gets damaged, but it would be dive bomber damage, not torpedo damage. So it would get the holes in the top, not the bombs, so it wouldn't sink. Unless their fires got completely out of control, which I can't imagine with Italian naval professionalism it's going to get completely out of control, unless the British score a lot of hits with bombers. And I mean a lot of bombs hit. And I know the skewer was accurate, but that would be a lot of hits. And they'd have to be using armor-piercing bombs, which again, the British are sort of slow to deploy on their on their carriers, on their naval strike aircraft. So yes and no, it's a possibility. But again, with more dive bombers and more using dive bombers, they might have got to the armor-piercing bombs earlier. In which case, they might well have them available. In which case, who knows what happens? It's one of those. Small butterfly wings, huge hurricanes can occur, or nothing can occur. It depends on whether it hits a mountain or not. But the point is, I think it's safe to say the Italian capital ships that are at Taranto are not there are not a lot of them left. Historically, 3 are severely damaged. I would say at least 5 are severely damaged in this, which leaves the Italians with just 2 probably viable capital ships. And I would say the 5 severely damaged ones, probably about 3 or 4 of them are never coming back. And I'd reckon the 2 which are the one that's not there, and the one with the Gilo Cesare, I reckon the Gilo Cesare which is there probably gets bombed up. So I don't think that's going to be much use for much of 1940, 1941. So that's going to change things. It's going to mean their convoys aren't going to have capital ship escort. And if the British convoys do have capital ship escort, even if it's an R class, that's probably going to be a trump card over the Italian heavy cruisers. There's also the fact that the more aircraft there, they're probably going to attack the cruisers as well, so there'll be damage to the cruiser fleet and the carrier and the capital ship fleet. And if both forces are down, then the odds are Crete doesn't fall. Now, if Crete doesn't fall, that's going to reduce the need of an aircraft carrier in the eastern Mediterranean, but it's because of the air security it's going to provide for the forces operating in the eastern Mediterranean, but the carrier's still going to be used. But you're not going to have the damage to carriers which take place historically. It's also going to have an impact on, therefore, on the convoy runs and the convoys through the through the scenario, because you're suddenly going to have a scenario where the convoys from Alexandria to Malta are going to be fairly safe runs, whereas the convoys from Gibraltar to Malta are still probably going to be quite tough, because France probably still falls as historically. But you're also going to have a difference going on in North Africa, because it's going to be far more difficult for the supplies, for the Italians to get supplies to North Africa, which could mean that even the forces which are reduced by sending forces to Greece and then withdrawing to Crete, as historically happens, those forces could get into that you could be getting a lot more forces actually available to support the North African coast. The Royal Navy could do a lot more fire support for the army on North African coast. So this means the North Africa campaign could be incredibly different, but also could mean that some of the convoy runs you have historically in the Mediterranean, which are huge damages, for which whilst they are emotional and strategic wins for the British in resupplying Malta, wouldn't have to happen, as you could do an east-west run. You could do an Alexandria to Malta run with far more security. So if you can do that, you don't then need to do those big campaigns, etc., and you can keep Malta going far more easily, which means you have forces more able to deploy elsewhere. Clear interest. How does a modern naval air fleet in the 1930s does it affect a battleship? Not really. Battleships are the same. A nicer way they're developed. In the full knowledge of aviation and its capabilities in the 1930s is what affects the battleships. Does it? It's not going to change things. And you know, one of the things that often people perceive the Swordfish as not being a modern naval aircraft. It's a very modern, very capable naval aircraft, which can do something which no other strike aircraft can do, which is launch its torpedoes to belly flop. The point that's made is you've got an increased naval air arm. You haven't got you haven't suddenly warped technology forward. Yes, it's going to be more viable because the Navy's going to be investing in it, and there's going to be a bit of competition going on between them and the Air Force. But their natural tendencies are going to be involved in the pushing, which is why I say the engine powered, because the needs of the Navy are that. The Navy's going to focus in on those needs, which don't really accord to the Air Ministry's needs. The thing is, it's going to mean that probably the British, if they do capital ships, if they're affected in any way, shape, or form, are going to have better air defense. They are than they already historically do. You might see less of an idea on the less of a concentration on the 5.25-inch gun and more of a concentration on a 4.7 or 4.5-inch dual purpose. Principally from the thing of they might concentrate on number of guns instead of the range of the guns. But I don't think it's going to have a massive impact on battleships and those things. I mean, Kriegsmarine starts with an anti-CVS doctrine. How effective will it be turn out is another question. It's fun. Shumat. The question is what techniques to cover. Everything seems to be figured out in peace at time, and then it turns out you made assumption doesn't work. See, Aztec and the submarines are attacking while surface at night. True, and also the fact that German torpedoes at the beginning of war are actually terrible. The fact that they work in taking out Courageous is quite an amazing feat. Clarke, I can't see the Germans being early in developing aviation because then the Germans designed the Deutschland class before the Anglo-German Naval Treaty. However, a Deutschland-based aviation ship is possible. I think it's still probably the Graf Zeppelin because the Germans will still be obsessed with the French. Blackburn Maxim, what kind of change for Japanese cruisers if they're building these scout cruisers? Heavy armament? More Type 93 torpedoes? Probably. Less likely for them to be building reconnaissance cruisers which have such an aviation-heavy air group back. So I would reckon their cruisers would be built as more fighting cruisers with a maximum 8-inch guns they can carry and more Type 93 torpedoes. So they'd be vicious ships, still fight. Take care, Carl. Genome, I've been meaning to compliment your site's vastly improved lighting. Your fluffy research went from an amorphous black blob with eyes, teeth, and legs to a fully visible party poodle. Thank you. Yeah, thank you. The system basically is as a white board mounted in my window, and I should probably get it down during the day, but I don't. I tend to leave it and just shine a light on it. So much of the war in Med is for want of nail, although the kingdom was lost. Yes. Littoria will be one of those not come back ships. Yes, Littoria won't be. Yeah, it's a case of imagine what Andrew Cunningham can do if he has a lot more nasty forces at his command, and if he doesn't lose as much nasty forces and has more strategic freedom. I have a feeling the Japanese would double down. They would probably building the Ryujos would be the 12,000 ton ships. So Ryujo will be about 12,000 tons. And that's going to make it a lot more interesting because instead of they might try and double down on it for 8,000 tons, but the thing is, their limit they've got, if I remember correctly, if we go back to the Japanese limitation. The Japanese limitation is 72,000 tons. So yeah, they could theoretically build 9 of 8,000 tons versus 6 of 12,000 tons, but I doubt they don't do that. I think what they might instead do is as an actual tonnage limitation is probably try and build them to 14,000 tons and claim they're 12,000 tons. Are German torpedoes more terrible than US Mark 6 exploder? German torpedoes at the beginning of the war cause Donets to go and actually threaten people. There is one thing which you can say about Donets, which has got me accused of being at one point on one of my videos, although the comment was never published because it was quite a rude comment. And it wasn't me who blocked it, it was YouTube who blocked it, and I just left it blocked. Because it was quite rude and nasty. Because apparently I said that Donets was actually, this was one saving grace for Donets, and one good thing for him. He believed his submariners, unlike the US Navy, and went and scared the living bejesus out of the scientists to get it fixed. This apparently, according to one commentator, made me pro-fascist. And I was sort of going, no, all I'm saying is a saving grace. And this was on Donets' video when I was talking about Donets. I was sort of thinking, well, my response to that would be, no, this is just me talking about a person and saying he has these bad qualities, including being a raving fascist, and that was not really a good thing. And he has these good qualities in that he actually did believe his officers when they told him their weapons weren't working. This doesn't make him a good person. This just makes him a human being. In that, even the worst person can occasionally can occasionally have some good qualities. It's fun. Sorry about the bang then. I put down my my glass. I have limited, though, to the Battle Atlantic and the Battle Mediterranean. Why? Because war would be cumulative, and at this point, I can't really predict. Because, again, if the Italians have lost the most air fleet at Taranto, and if the British aren't suffering as much in the Battle Atlantic, then instead of having to supply a major fleet to the Mediterranean and a major fleet to the Atlantic, they might well have to supply likely less fleet to the Atlantic and a lot less fleet to the Mediterranean, which means they can have more of a fleet in the Far East. What does this mean? Well, I have no idea. But if you think about it, if you don't need to keep more than a couple of... If you've got all the strike carriers you're building, etc., you could well maintain. You could have well have put 2 in the Indian Ocean, and in fact, you could keep the ones from the Mediterranean in the Indian Ocean. One of the things I can see for happening is them going, right then, we've dealt with the capital ships. If we need these ships, we want them close by, but we don't want them in range of Italian submarines. Send them into the Indian Ocean. Then they can be useful. They can deal with help protect against surface raiders. They can reinforce and help deter the Japanese whilst being on call for the Mediterranean. So what you could well do is get a British Eastern Fleet being built in the Indian Ocean, not at Singapore, in the Indian Ocean. So they're basically the on-call force to go and reinforce the Mediterranean Fleet if anything major happens and they suddenly need reinforcements. But probably you would have things like, well, you don't need to risk your Warspite and your Valiant and your Queen Elizabeth. Now, you can decide that maybe you're going to keep your rebuilt Queen Elizabeths back in home fleet to deal with any Bismarck or Tirpitz which comes out, instead of relying on Hood, etc. But you could well have things like Renown, probably quite possibly Renown, and a couple of carriers, and maybe even your Nelson and Rodney out in the Indian Ocean, because they can be there and brought through to Mediterranean if you need them, if you need the reinforcement. But if you don't need them, they are positioned forward there and they're useful there as deterrents, which could be an interesting scenario for the Japanese. Because again, if the Japanese are looking at it and going, right then, we're going to destroy the Americans in Hawaii and Honolulu. Okay, we destroyed the Americans, but the British fleet is sitting in the Indian Ocean and we have to send a full fleet down to deal with them as well. And that's going to be a whole different scenario. So there is no way of orchestrating a similar strike on a British fleet held in the Indian Ocean as there is of doing the strike on the Americans in Hawaii. Because, if you think about it, for the Americans in Hawaii, they can go straight across an empty ocean. They can avoid the sea lanes. If you think about trying to go down, right, they'd have to go down. They probably have to go round Australia, Think about that distance, and then up through the Indian Ocean, through the Antarctic Ocean, and up in the Indian Ocean. Now that's a huge distance, and fuel-wise and capacity, they could try and do it. They might even achieve it. But that's a massive effort, and they are probably going to they'd probably ruin their ability to do anything else for the rest of the war, just by doing that effort. They certainly couldn't do that effort and also attack, and also send a sufficient enough fleet to attack the British in the Indian Ocean that way, and also send a sufficient fleet to go and attack Honolulu. Yes, they've got the scout carriers, etc., but they're probably not going to use them for that. So it'd be kind of interesting. It would be interesting, but it would be sort of that you'd have more of a force set up there. So you'd have fleet carriers and a fleet there, and you'd have probably still the scout carriers would be the presence in the China station. And there, you also therefore possibly have to reduce your forces less in that region. So some of the maneuvers of forces would not be taking place, and you wouldn't have so much reinforcement needed. You might also even have, and this is a real possibility, right? If you stop 2 convoys getting through from Italy to North Africa, their forces in North Africa run out of supplies. They are that tight. In fact, honestly, you can make the case for a single convoy if you pick the right convoy. So if they have lost the forces which cover them in 1940, there is the possibility that before December 1941, there is no more fighting going on in North Africa. In which case, there is a massive difference in terms of British commitment to war effort going on if they suddenly find themselves fighting a war in Southeast Asia. Let me guess, they were very nasty expressions. Yes, they also suggested that I was anti-American by saying that, because I made a similar comparison to what IKB4472 has just suggested, which was suggesting that he actually listened rather than Donitz actually listened to his officers, unlike the Bureau of Ordnance did. I didn't realise that was me being anti-American. I thought that was just me stating history. By the way, please note, there are also British problems in history, and if you want me to give a full video talking about that, I think you'll find them in almost every other video. I have pointed out complaints and issues. And if I remember correctly, one of the problems for the Kriegsmarine, etc., is they're not able to do the level of testing which the British are able to do. The reason the British torpedoes work and the American and German ones don't is because the British have tested their torpedoes pretty much everywhere in the frigating world, and it's the British therefore have been able to test theirs with all the varying electromagnetic patterns of the Earth that you get around the world, whereas the Germans have tested theirs pretty much in a certain part of the Baltic, which was found to actually be a bit of a null area as terms of the Earth's magnetic system, and so they haven't done the testing, and just going from the Baltic to the Norwegian coast to the North Atlantic, they found their torpedoes weren't working. The Americans, it's much the same. It worked where it was tested, but they didn't test anywhere else. Right. Literally half of this channel is Kriegsmarine bashing. I don't know. There's a very short list of things they don't do right. They did right, and fixing the torpedoes was one of them. Yeah, the trouble is I am the most non-wereaboo in a nicest way. When you're in these, I'd spend probably more time bigging up. If I could be accused of anything, it's probably being pro-Italian Navy at various points, because I actually do correct a lot of the history, which is Italian Navy stupid bad, and I'm going, no, they have good reasons for what they're doing. Me and the German light cruiser construction, for goodness sake, I would gladly erase them from history. Any chance in any video I get to erase them from history, I do, because they're just that bad. Yeah, some people just don't like you critiquing their countries. And you just go, well, yeah, but I critique my own, so I'm critiquing everyone. And Italians do nice looking chips, Alzaski, they do. Yeah, that's not anti-American history vanguard. That's pro-Canadian. Um, so summary. I hope you found this interesting. I know I did looking through because last time we looked at this from the point of view of a strike and how strike carriers, and the emphasis will be on strike carrier development. It was really interesting figuring out. Hang on, no, if it's down to spotters, it will be on the scout reconnaissance carrier, and that's going to have an even bigger impact. You know, having those extra carriers, you cannot overstate the impact of having those 10 extra carriers is going to have. At the beginning of World War II, because you end up with, broadly speaking, 16 carriers instead of 7. And the other carriers, like Argus and Eagle, would be very able to be quickly brought back into service because they wouldn't have been scrapped that long ago. So they wouldn't be out of service for that long before they're brought back in. So you'd basically be starting World War II with 18 carriers in service. And that has a massive difference. It could even be more than that because you could have, of course, have got rid of Hermes as well early on. So you could be starting World War II with 19 carriers in service, and a Royal Navy which is starting World War II with 19 carriers in service versus 7 or 8 is in a massively different scenario. Especially as those carriers will take on, the smaller carriers will free up the larger carriers to do strike and those sort of the large fleet operations and be focused in on that, whilst they do the anti-submarine warfare and the convoy warfare roles, and some of the sort of the perpetual at sea stuff. It will have a massive cumulative difference in terms of experience. If you think about that, that means that the Royal Navy will have had at least 16, well, probably if you consider you'll change captains roughly every 18 months to 2 years. If you think about that, if you go from 7 to having 16, you will have quadruple the number of, quadruple if not more of the number of officers gone through as you did originally, because it's going to be cumulative. So you have all that many more captains, all that many more damage control officers and junior officers. You go down to them going through, and midshipmen, and all those things with carrier experience going into the wider Navy. You'll have a far larger pool of experience in the wider Navy. You'll have a far larger experience pool in the Navy. And that's going to affect things. It's going to affect their operations. It's going to affect their capabilities. So you are looking at a sea change in the force and the force structure and its capabilities. The impact of that is going to be dramatic. The interesting thing is, again, I could see this change in this differential, especially in the treaties, having the most impact on the Royal Navy, the US Navy, and the Imperial Japanese Navy. The reason it will have impact on those three is those three are the three investing in navies. I have a feeling the French, if they do build anything more other than the Burn, it will be some of those smaller carriers instead of their seaplane carrier. And if the Italians build anything at all, it will probably be smaller carriers. They probably won't build a bigger vessel, or they might just build one bigger one and matched Burn completely. But I think they go a smaller one. Adapting this to my Equitable Washington Naval Treaty would be an interesting scenario. Putting this through the Equitable Treaty, that would be an interesting mixture. But this would have built definitely a more interesting scenario in the first place. And if you consider in that scenario, you'd have ended up with, as I seem to remember, I did a 7 to 10 ratio, so I did 10 carriers, fleet carriers, so it would be 300,000 tons of fleet carriers. It would be 20 20 if we're going the same mixture. It'd be 20 scout carriers. So so that would be again 300. That would be 240,000 tons worth of scout carriers. Yeah, that would be a colossal difference. That would be just so beyond. That would be obscenely different. Fran, I think you might need to arrange for next year maybe to do a lecture talk with viewers and QA in the end. How do we go? I am looking at it. I'm having a talk with people because I might do one even actually this year. I'm having a I've messaged and chatting away with some of my colleagues from King's College London, and because they do the Lawton Naval History series, and I'm seeing if they'd maybe like me to turn up next year and do a talk for them on something. I was considering going back and doing another talk on destroyers in World War II. Could be interesting. It could be fun. On 9681, don't take this wrong way, but I'm not touching that one with a 10-foot barge pole at that point. There's a reason I'm not touching that one. I have seen what's happened to channels which touch that point if they're British, and I am just not. I have great respect and a lot of family who lived for a long time in India, as you can imagine with my family. And I have, even despite my skin tone, well, actually no, because I think several of my aunts were Indian, etc. Sort of great aunts. But it's a case of, yeah, I'm not touching that topic with a 10-foot barge pole. Also, another couple of announcements before I sort of finish things for the evening, and is tomorrow night it's UAD on Twitch, so it'll be Ultimate Admiral Dreadnoughts. I do remember someone has got a question for a Sovereign style battleship construction and what we can do with that, and so I'm looking forward to that one, and I'm as well building as early as I can do on UAD. And on Sunday we're starting Rome. And seeing as the public has spoken, we're starting Remastered. But there's a trouble. I haven't played through enough games on Rome to actually play my normal campaign group, which is the Seleucids. So we're going to be playing probably one of the Roman factions. So I will say here there are two-part questions. One, I would love to hear in the comments below when you've had time to think about it, and I'll ask him the same thing on Saturday's version. So you can save your comment response for that one if you want to. What you think the other navies would have built, because I've talked about the Royal Navy, but I'd love to hear what you think the Japanese and the Americans and the Italians and the French would have responded with. And the second question is, which Roman faction do you want me to do? Because my favourite, of course, is the Scipii. I'm sorry, I like the Scipii. They have the best navy. They produce absolutely gorgeous looking troops because they're all blue, and yeah, I like the blue. I find the green a bit garish of the Brutii, and I find the red too Roman, too predictable for the Julii. And they have a lot of fun. They are a lot of fun, but I'll be looking forward to sort of seeing what you say. I did a test with Rome in the original, and I came back and said, right, you can pick whether I play it in this version or I get the remastered version. Everyone suggested the remastered version, so I this week spent the £25 and bought the remastered version for you, because you wanted the remastered version for its viewing. Now, also, the brew ships on Sunday is going to be Mahan and the books inspired by his writings. Some of them I have here. So this is going to be one of the ones on Sunday. Mahan on Naval Warfare by Alfred Fair Mahan. The Interests of America in Sea Power, Present and Future, 1897 by Alfred Fair Mahan. And of course, this is my new favourite version of this book, which I'm using, is the Influence of Sea Power upon History, 1660 to 1783, by Alfred Fair Mahan. Reason it's my new favourite version is because it is quite so massive, I can get decent photocopies of it if I need to give my students a couple of pages. It's only ever a couple of pages before the publishers get annoyed with me. It's a couple of pages because they need to be able to scribble over it, and I prefer them scribbling over photocopies than the actual books before any publishers get annoyed with me. Also, other books which will be out tomorrow, which will be here. We have this one, which is Strategic Theories. This is by Admiral Raoul Castex of the French Navy. It was translated by a lecturer at the American Army War College, and it's an absolutely interesting book if you want to read Mahan combined with the Junicole. And there's a couple of other books as well. So I've got the 6 books planned for Sunday, and they're all Mahan themed, including, of course, this one. I haven't heard anything about the A Museum in Cornwall being forced to close and move by the council, but I'll find out in September when I go down there. See, I don't think the Roman faction really makes a difference. It does to me. In Rome Mastered, you can get all the factions from the beginning in the settings. And even unlock factions like Macedonians. Ooh. So far I've played it only once and I couldn't, but I will see. Alex, do you think the graphics are much better for broadcasting as I suggested? Yes, they are. That's why I went with it. And people seem to all say the remastered was better, so I went and found a remastered and bought it and went, yeah, this is going to be better for broadcasting. Thanks so much. The Brute has more cities that can recruit legionnaires. Mm-hmm. Is the influence of CPAR still upon the Kindle's history still free on Kindle? Yes, I think so. There were in the Mahan video. There are links to all sorts of all sorts of books. Doctor, you should write a book entitled "The Art of Presence, Naval Diplomacy and Deterrence." That's a long-term plan. There is something on that plan in my writing. I have been looking at the suggestions for June, and they are lovely coming in. If you want to, I will go through some of them. Actually, no, I'll go through them on Sunday. But basically, that's because there are going to be announcements coming soon about what's going on in June. And as you can see, I'm preparing videos to cover the whole of June. Anyway, what I'm going to say now is I'm going to say thank you very much to everyone. I'm going to say goodbye to everyone, and then I'm going to appear on Discord in about 10 minutes. For roughly half an hour, I'm going to be in the general chat area to chat away and answer any questions you have. And so if you go to the link down below, you'll find a link to the Discord server. And I hope you enjoy that. Now, thank you, Sean Mack, Melanie1640, and Seneca Nero, and I think Paul from Chicago was also here as the admins this evening. Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone, for chatting away. And Jack Ray was here as well. Thank you, HMS Verdun, Blackburn Maximum, DG40, 96831, Steve Clarke, Bijon, HMS Verdun, Albert Zaski, and John South, and Stephen Quigley, Stephen Richards, Sean Quigley. Sorry, I combined yours and Richards' names. New IQB 4472, and George Newman, Mark Hartness. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Thank you, GD Harmon. Thank you, Calvin Gasberg. Thank you, Friendly Sea Mine. Thank you, Tanif Velika. Thank you, Joss Fonk. Thank you, Michael Cooch. Thank you. Ooh. Who am I missing? I'm missing someone. I know. Thank you, Leslie Mitchell. I knew I spotted you there earlier on. Thank you, Paul Beswick. Thank you, Inns Morrisons. Thank you, Night Heron Productions. I'm not sure if I said that yet, but I will say thank you. Again, if I have said it already, but if I haven't, then I said thank you. And then thank you. Thank you, everyone. It's been fun, and I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you found it interesting. Thank you, everyone. Take care.